The train was leaving, and Evelyn Hart was utterly alone. No uncle, no family, no future. Just dust, disappointment, and a dying desert town that didn't want her. But then a shadow moved. A cowboy with eyes like storm clouds and a voice that cut through her despair like lightning through darkness. He offered his hand, and she took it, not knowing that this single choice would lead her from the edge of ruin to the threshold of everything she'd ever wanted. Stay with me until the end of this story, and comment below what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Evelyn's journey travels. The iron wheels screamed against the rails, metal grinding metal, and Evelyn Hart pressed her gloved hand against the soot-stained window of the westbound train. Beyond the glass, the world had transformed from the manicured greens of Boston to something vast and hostile. An endless expanse of rust-colored earth stretched beneath a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Arizona Territory, 1875. The words on her ticket seemed like a promise written in a foreign language. Whispering Creek, next stop. The conductor's voice carried through the passenger car, rough as sandpaper. Whispering Creek. Evelyn's fingers tightened on the letter in her lap. The paper was soft from countless readings, the ink fading at the creases where she'd folded and unfolded it during the endless journey west. My dearest niece, it began in her Uncle Thomas's careful script. Come to Whispering Creek. There is a home for you here, and a future brighter than anything Boston can offer. The West is hard, but it is honest, and there is room for those brave enough to start anew. She'd memorized every word during the 3 weeks of travel, the trains, the stagecoaches, the countless nights in roadside hotels where the sheets smelled of lie and loneliness. After the scandal in Boston, after Randall's betrayal, and her family's subsequent disownment, Uncle Thomas's letter had arrived like a life raft thrown to a drowning woman. He was her mother's brother, a man she barely remembered from childhood, who'd gone west 20 years ago and never returned. But he'd remembered her. He'd offered her salvation. The train lurched, shuddering as it began to slow. Evelyn stood, smoothing her traveling dress. Deep green wool that had been fashionable in Boston 6 months ago, but now felt absurdly formal against the brutal landscape outside. Her reflection in the window showed a woman of 24 with dark hair pinned beneath a modest hat, pale skin that had seen too many tearful nights, and eyes that held equal parts hope and terror. Other passengers began gathering their belongings. A family with 3 children, a merchant with a sample case, 2 men in dusty work clothes who'd boarded in Tucson. They all moved with the casual confidence of people who knew where they were going, who had someone waiting for them. Evelyn gripped the handle of her carpet bag and stood on trembling legs. The train ground to a final, shuddering halt. Through the window, she could see Whispering Creek for the first time, if you could call it that. A scattered collection of wooden buildings huddled against the desert like survivors of a shipwreck clinging to debris. A main street of packed dirt, a water tower that looked half collapsed, a saloon with a crooked sign. The train depot itself was hardly more than a covered platform with a small office attached. Ma'am? The conductor appeared beside her, his weathered face neutral but not unkind. This is your stop. Yes, thank you. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin, uncertain. He tipped his cap and moved on to help an elderly woman with her trunk. Evelyn took a deep breath, tasting dust and something acrid, smoke, perhaps, or the scent of the desert itself, and stepped into the aisle. The platform was chaos. Passengers disembarking, a freight handler shouting about cargo, somewhere a dog barking frantically. The heat hit her the moment she stepped down from the train, a physical force that stole the breath from her lungs. Boston had been cool and gray when she'd left, autumn rain making the cobblestones slick. This was something else entirely. This was fire and brightness and air so dry it seemed to crack against her skin. Evelyn stood on the platform, her carpet bag in one hand, and looked around for Uncle Thomas. The family with children was met by a beaming man in a wagon. The merchant was already negotiating with the driver about transport to the territorial capital. The 2 workers simply walked off toward town, their boots kicking up small clouds of dust. No one approached Evelyn. She scanned the platform again, more carefully this time. Perhaps Uncle Thomas had been delayed. Perhaps he'd sent someone to fetch her. She looked for anyone who might be searching for a newcomer, anyone whose eyes held recognition. Nothing. The platform began to empty. The freight handler finished loading bags onto a cart. The train's engine hissed and groaned, preparing for the next leg of its journey. And still, no one came. Evelyn felt the first cold thread of fear wind through her chest. "Excuse me," she called to the station master, an older man with white whiskers who was marking something on a clipboard. "Excuse me, sir." He glanced up, taking in her Boston dress and expensive luggage with a single assessing look. "Yes, miss?" "I'm looking for Thomas Hart. He owns property in the area, I believe. Do you know where I might find him?" The station master's expression shifted, just slightly, but enough for Evelyn to notice. Something that might have been sympathy flickered across his face before he locked it down. "Thomas Hart, you say?" "Yes. He's my uncle. He wrote to me, asked me to come. He should be here to meet me, but I don't see—" "Miss." The station master set down his clipboard. "When did your uncle write to you?" The fear tightened. 6 weeks ago. Why?" The old man removed his hat, holding it against his chest in a gesture that Evelyn recognized with sudden, horrible clarity. It was the same gesture she'd seen at her mother's funeral, at her father's years before. "Miss, I'm afraid I have some difficult news. Thomas Hart passed on about 3 months back. Fever took him, sudden-like. I'm very sorry." The world tilted. Evelyn heard the words, understood them individually, but couldn't quite make them connect into meaning. Uncle Thomas was dead, had been dead for months, which meant the letter he'd sent, the promise of a home, the dream that had carried her across a continent, all of it had been written by a man who no longer existed. "That's not possible," she heard herself say. "He wrote to me. He invited me." "Yes, miss. I expect he did, before the fever came on. Mail from out here to back east can take a powerful long time, especially if it has to be rerouted. I'm truly sorry you came all this way." The train whistle screamed, a sound like grief itself. Evelyn turned and watched as the locomotive began to pull away, taking with it the last physical connection to everything she'd left behind. The cars picked up speed, rolling past the platform, and then they were gone, leaving only the fading echo of wheels on rails and a settling cloud of dust. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. "Miss?" The station master's voice seemed to come from very far away. "Do you have people back east? Someone I could wire for you?" Evelyn thought of her aunt's house in Boston, the place she'd lived after her parents died. She thought of Aunt Millicent's face when the scandal broke, when Randall's lies had been believed over Evelyn's truth, when the gossip had spread through their social circle like poison. She thought of that final conversation. "You've brought shame on this family, Evelyn. I cannot have you under my roof. You must leave." "No," she whispered. "There's no one." The station master's sympathy deepened to something like pity, which was somehow worse. "I see. Well, there's a boarding house in town, Mrs. Chen's place. Not fancy, but clean. I expect I have very little money." The admission came out flat, emotionless. It was simply a fact, as true as the desert heat or the dust in the air. The journey west had taken nearly everything she had. She'd counted on Uncle Thomas, on the home he'd promised. Without that, how much is very little? Evelyn opened her reticule with shaking hands and counted the coins inside. $3.70. It might as well have been 3 pennies. "Not enough for long-term boarding, I imagine." The station master sighed. "No, miss, not in Whispering Creek, I'm afraid. Mrs. Chen charges $1 a week, and that's the cheapest rate in town." Less than 4 weeks, then, before she'd be completely destitute. 4 weeks to find work, to make a life, to somehow survive in a place where she knew no one and had nothing. The impossibility of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical weight. "Is there perhaps work available?" she asked, though she already knew the answer from the pity in the old man's eyes. "I can read and write. I'm educated. I could teach or keep accounts or—" "Miss, forgive me for being blunt, but you're a young, unmarried woman alone in a rough territory. The kind of work available to someone in your situation—" He trailed off delicately. Evelyn understood. She'd heard the whispers back east about women who went west alone, about what became of them. Saloon girls. Worse. The understanding made her stomach turn. "There must be something," she said, and hated how desperate she sounded. Surely there's some respectable position. Perhaps the school teacher could use an assistant, the station master offered doubtfully. Or one of the ranches might need house help. But miss, you should understand, the territory is no place for a woman alone. It's hard country, dangerous. Most folks would advise you to take that last bit of money and buy a ticket back east on the next train through. Back east? To what? To whom? She'd rather die in the desert than return to Boston in defeat, to prove Aunt Millicent right, to give Randall and his new wife the satisfaction of knowing they'd destroyed her completely. When does the next train come through? She asked quietly. Day after tomorrow, headed back to Tucson. 48 hours. 48 hours to decide whether to retreat or somehow, impossibly, move forward into this hostile new world. The platform was empty now except for the two of them. The other passengers had dispersed into the town or been collected by waiting friends and family. Evelyn's trunk sat alone near the depot office, a physical representation of everything she had left, which wasn't much. A few dresses, some books, her mother's jewelry, which she'd managed to hide from Aunt Millicent. Memories wrapped in worn fabric. Thank you for your kindness, Evelyn said to the station master. I'll need to think. He nodded, settling his hat back on his head. Your trunk will be safe inside the depot overnight. You're welcome to sit on the platform while you consider your options. And miss? His voice gentled. I truly am sorry about your uncle. Thomas Hart was a good man, one of the best. This territory is poorer for losing him. He turned and walked back into the depot office, leaving Evelyn alone on the empty platform. She stood there as the afternoon sun began its slow descent toward the horizon. The town of Whispering Creek spread before her, small, dusty, indifferent to her existence. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear music from the saloon, voices raised in argument or laughter, she couldn't tell which, the creak of wagon wheels, the whisper of wind across the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and sun-baked earth. This was supposed to be her new beginning, her salvation. Instead, it was just another ending. Evelyn sat down on a bench near the depot office, her carpetbag at her feet, and stared out at the foreign landscape. The fear that had been building since the station master's revelation began to transform into something else, something hollow and dark that settled in her chest like a stone. She'd been foolish. Foolish to believe in Uncle Thomas's letter. Foolish to think the West would welcome her with open arms. Foolish to imagine that running from one disaster could lead to anything but another. The sun continued its descent, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Beautiful, in a harsh sort of way. Everything out here seemed harsh, the heat, the landscape, the very air itself. Boston had been cruel in its social judgments and whispered scandals, but at least it had been familiar. At least she'd understood the rules, even when they condemned her. Here, she understood nothing. Excuse me, miss. The voice came from behind her, masculine and low. Evelyn startled, turning quickly. A man stood at the edge of the platform, and for a moment, all she could process was size. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a frame that suggested both strength and capability. He wore the clothing of a working man, worn denim pants, a dusty cotton shirt open at the collar, a vest that had seen better days, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. A gun belt sat low on his hips, the holster well used but carefully maintained. But it was his eyes that caught her. Even in the shadow of his hat brim, she could see them, gray-blue, like storm clouds over water. Steady, assessing, not unkind. I didn't mean to startle you, he said, his voice carrying a faint drawl that was neither harsh nor soft. I'm looking for Miss Evelyn Hart. Her breath caught. I'm Evelyn Hart. He stepped up onto the platform, moving with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his own body. Up close she could see more details, the sun-weathered tan of his skin, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested years of squinting against bright light, the shadow of stubble along his jaw. He was perhaps 35, give or take a few years, handsome in a rough, unpolished way that was entirely different from the refined men of Boston society. Miss Hart. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. My name is Jack Fletcher. I own a ranch about 10 miles north of town. I knew your uncle. The hollow feeling in Evelyn's chest shifted slightly. You knew Thomas? Yes, ma'am. He was a good friend and a better neighbor. When he passed, it was a loss to the whole territory. Jack's expression sobered. I heard from the station master that you'd arrived from Boston, expecting to meet him. I'm very sorry for your loss, and sorrier still that you had to learn about it this way. Evelyn found herself unable to look away from his steady gaze. There was something in his manner, a quiet certainty perhaps, or simply a lack of the pity she'd seen in the station master's eyes, that made her feel slightly less adrift. Thank you, she managed. I didn't know. He wrote to me, invited me to come west, but the letter must have been sent before. She couldn't quite finish the sentence. Jack nodded. Mail's slow out here. Sometimes letters arrive months after they're written. He glanced at the setting sun, then back to her. Miss Hart, forgive me for being direct, but do you have somewhere to stay tonight? Family or friends in the area? No, I have no one. The admission should have been humiliating, but somehow saying it to this stranger was easier than saying it to the station master had been. Perhaps because Jack Fletcher didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her as if she were simply a person facing a problem that needed solving. I see. He was quiet for a moment, clearly considering something. I don't mean to be forward, but the station master mentioned you might be in difficult circumstances. Is that accurate? Evelyn straightened her spine, summoning what remained of her pride. I have very little money, if that's what you're asking. But I'm educated and capable. I can work. I simply need time to find a position. I'm sure you can, ma'am. That's not what concerns me. Jack's voice remained gentle but firm. What concerns me is that you're alone in a rough town with night coming on. Whispering Creek isn't Boston. The wrong sort of men might see a woman in your situation and get ideas that aren't gentlemanly. The fear that had been lurking at the edges of Evelyn's awareness suddenly sharpened into focus. She'd been so consumed with grief and shock that she hadn't fully considered the immediate danger of her situation. A woman alone, with no protection, no connections. She might as well have had a target painted on her back. What are you suggesting? She asked carefully. Jack looked uncomfortable for the first time since approaching her. Miss Hart, I want to be clear about something first. I'm not offering anything improper, but your uncle was a friend of mine, and I reckon he'd want someone to look after his niece now that he can't. So here's what I'm proposing. I've got a housekeeper at my ranch, Mrs. Guthrie. She's a respectable widow, been with me for 5 years. I've also got a spare room. You're welcome to stay there, proper and chaperoned, while we figure out what to do about your uncle's property and your situation. No cost, no obligation, just hospitality until you get your bearings. Evelyn stared at him. Every rule of proper society, every warning she'd ever received about trusting strangers, especially male strangers, screamed at her to refuse. This man could be anyone, could want anything. But as she looked into those steady gray-blue eyes, she found herself believing him. Perhaps it was desperation. Perhaps it was intuition. Or perhaps it was simply that she'd already lost everything and had nothing left to protect. Why would you do this? She asked. You don't know me. No, ma'am, I don't. But I knew Thomas Hart, and he spoke of you. Said his sister's daughter was smart and strong and deserved better than life had given her. He meant to give you a fresh start out here. Jack's expression was earnest. I can't bring your uncle back, but I can honor his intention by making sure you're safe while you find your feet. That's all I'm offering, time and safety, nothing more. The sincerity in his voice was unmistakable. Evelyn thought of her options. Spend precious money on boarding while desperately searching for work in a town that likely had none for her, or accept this stranger's offer and at least have a roof over her head while she figured out her next move. It wasn't really a choice at all. I accept, she said quietly. And thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Your kindness is more than I deserve. Just Jack, ma'am, and you deserve better than you've gotten, I suspect. He glanced at her trunk near the depot office. Is that your luggage? Yes. Everything I have. Jack moved to the trunk and lifted it as if it weighed nothing, settling it on one broad shoulder. My wagon's just down the street. If you're ready, we can head out now. Get you settled before full dark. Evelyn picked up her carpet bag and followed him off the platform. As they walked down the main street of Whispering Creek, she was aware of eyes watching them. People on the wooden sidewalks, faces in windows, A group of men outside the saloon. She could feel their curiosity, their speculation. The stranger from Boston walking with Jack Fletcher. By tomorrow, the whole town would be talking. But she found she didn't care. Let them talk. She'd survived worse than gossip. Jack's wagon was exactly what she'd expected. Practical, well-maintained, drawn by two sturdy horses that looked at her with mild interest as they approached. He loaded her trunk into the back with easy efficiency, then offered his hand to help her up onto the bench seat. His hand was calloused and strong, the hand of a man who worked with them. When he released her fingers and climbed up beside her, Evelyn found herself hyper-aware of his presence, the solid bulk of him, the faint smell of leather and horses and something else. Something clean like soap or fresh air. It's about an hour's ride to the ranch, Jack said as he took up the reins. We'll get there just after sunset if we keep a good pace. That's fine. Evelyn settled her skirts around her, trying to find some semblance of composure. Tell me about my uncle, if you would. I hardly knew him. He left Boston when I was very young. Jack clicked to the horses and the wagon rolled forward, leaving Whispering Creek behind. Thomas was one of the first settlers in this area. Came out about 20 years ago, like you said. He was a solitary man, but good-hearted. Helped folks when they needed it. He had a piece of land in a valley about 5 miles from my spread. Good water, cottonwood trees. He ran a few cattle, kept a garden, lived simple. Was he alone? Evelyn asked. No family out here at all? No, ma'am. Never married that I knew of. I think he kept in touch with folks back east, got letters now and then, but he'd built his life out here. Used to say the territory had saved him, though he never said from what. Evelyn thought of her own reasons for fleeing Boston. Perhaps Uncle Thomas had been running from something too. The thought made her feel slightly less alone. The desert around them transformed as the sun continued to sink toward the horizon. The harsh light softened into something almost beautiful, gold and amber painting the rocks and sand, purple shadows pooling in the low places. In the distance, mountains rose like the backs of sleeping giants. It's so empty, Evelyn murmured, not quite meaning to say it aloud. Is it? Jack's voice held a note of amusement. I've always thought it was pretty full myself. Just full of different things than Boston, I expect. Look there. He pointed to the left. That's a red-tailed hawk. And see those tracks? Coyote passed through here this morning. And if you look close at those rocks, you'll see desert flowers trying to bloom. It's not empty, Miss Hart. It's just quiet. She followed his gesture, trying to see what he saw. And slowly, the landscape began to reveal itself, not as a barren wasteland, but as something alive and wild and strangely compelling. They rode in silence for a while. The only sounds, the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic plod of the horses' hooves, and the endless whisper of wind across the desert. It should have been uncomfortable, Evelyn thought, sitting beside this stranger in the middle of nowhere. But somehow it wasn't. Jack Fletcher's presence was oddly reassuring, solid and calm and utterly without threat. Can I ask you something? Evelyn ventured after a while. Of course. Why did you really come for me today? The truth. Jack was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I told you, I knew your uncle, and he'd want you looked after. But I suppose the fuller truth is that I know what it's like to arrive somewhere alone and lost, expecting one thing and finding something entirely different. Someone gave me a hand when I needed it. I figure I ought to do the same when I can. You came from somewhere else too? Virginia, originally. Fought in the war, drifted west after. Ended up in Arizona Territory about 8 years ago with nothing but a horse and bad memories. A man named Samuel Carter owned the land that's now my ranch. He was getting old, had no family. He took me on as a hand, taught me ranching, and when he died, he left me the property in his will. Said every man deserves a second chance. There was something in the way he said it, a weight of history and gratitude that made Evelyn's throat tight. So you're paying forward a kindness, she said softly. I suppose I am. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence now. The sun touched the horizon, bleeding red across the sky. And as the wagon rolled on through the desert twilight, Evelyn felt something inside her chest loosen just slightly. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the possibility of hope. The ranch appeared as the last light was fading, a cluster of buildings nestled against a low rise. illuminated by warm lamplight spilling from windows. Even in the gathering dark, Evelyn could see that it was well maintained. A house, a barn, several outbuildings, corrals with horses. Smoke rose from a chimney, carrying the scent of cooking food. Jack pulled the wagon up to the house and set the brake. Before he could dismount to help her down, the front door opened and a woman emerged, short, sturdy, with gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. She wore a practical dress and an apron, and her face held the kind of weathered kindness that comes from years of hard work and harder living. "Jack Fletcher, it's about time you got back," she called. "I was starting to worry." "And who—" She stopped as her eyes fell on Evelyn. "My stars, is this Thomas Hart's niece?" "Yes, ma'am. Mrs. Guthrie, this is Miss Evelyn Hart, just arrived from Boston. Miss Hart, may I present Mrs. Sarah Guthrie, my housekeeper and the person who actually runs this ranch." Mrs. Guthrie approached the wagon, her sharp eyes taking in Evelyn's fine clothes and exhausted face. "Child, you look like you've been through hell and back. Come down from there. Let's get you inside. Jack, bring her trunk to the guest room. I'll heat some water for washing and get supper on the table." Within minutes, Evelyn found herself shepherded into the ranch house, a sturdy adobe structure with thick walls and cool interiors. The main room was simple but comfortable, with handmade furniture, colorful woven rugs on the floor, and books lining makeshift shelves along one wall. It smelled of wood smoke and bread and coffee, the scents of home. Mrs. Guthrie led her down a short hallway to a small bedroom. "It's not fancy," the older woman said, lighting a lamp on the bedside table. "But the mattress is clean, and you'll have privacy. There's a lock on the door if it makes you feel safer, though I'll tell you right now that Jack Fletcher is as honorable as they come. You're as safe here as you'd be in church, maybe safer." Tears suddenly pressed behind Evelyn's eyes. The simple kindness, the matter-of-fact acceptance, it was almost more than she could bear after the day she'd had. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know how to repay—" "Hush now," Mrs. Guthrie patted her arm briskly. "There'll be time enough for talk tomorrow. Tonight, you need food and rest. Wash up, then come to the kitchen. And child?" Her voice softened. "I'm sorry about Thomas. He was a good man. The best kind." After Mrs. Guthrie left, Evelyn stood in the small room and let herself simply breathe. Her trunk sat at the foot of the bed where Jack had placed it. The lamp cast gentle shadows on the walls. Through the small window, she could see the last remnants of twilight fading into true night. She'd left Boston 3 weeks ago, expecting to find family, security, a new life. Instead, she'd found death, uncertainty, and this, the unexpected kindness of strangers who owed her nothing. Evelyn washed her face and hands in the basin Mrs. Guthrie had provided, changed into a simpler dress, and pinned her hair up more practically. Then she took a deep breath and went to find the kitchen. Jack and Mrs. Guthrie were already seated at a scarred wooden table, steaming plates of food before them. Jack had removed his hat and gun belt, making him look somehow more human, just a man settling in for supper after a long day. "Sit, sit," Mrs. Guthrie commanded, gesturing to an empty chair. "There's stew and fresh bread, nothing fancy, but it'll fill you up." Evelyn sat, and Mrs. Guthrie ladled thick beef stew into a bowl for her. The smell alone made her mouth water. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. They ate for a while in companionable silence. The stew was rich and savory, full of tender meat and vegetables. The bread was still warm from the oven. It was the best meal Evelyn had eaten in weeks, possibly months. "So," Mrs. Guthrie said eventually, setting down her spoon, "Jack told me a bit of your situation on the way back from town. Thomas passed before you could arrive, and you've got no other family out here. That about the size of it?" "Yes, ma'am," Evelyn said quietly. "And you've got no money to speak of, no connections, no prospects." The bluntness should have stung, but somehow it didn't. Mrs. Guthrie was simply stating facts, not passing judgment. "That's correct." "Well then," the older woman exchanged a look with Jack. "Here's what we're going to do. You'll stay here as long as you need. No arguments, no payment required. In the meantime, we'll look into Thomas's property, see what he left behind. He may have had money saved or assets you can sell. At the very least, he had land, and land out here is valuable. We'll figure out what you've inherited, if anything, and then we'll figure out what comes next. Agreed?" Evelyn looked between them, this taciturn cowboy and his forthright housekeeper, and felt something crack open in her chest. Not quite tears, but close. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Jack met her eyes across the table. "Your uncle was my friend. That's enough. And besides," Mrs. Guthrie added with a small smile, "this house could use a woman's touch beyond my own. It'll be nice having another female around, someone to talk to who isn't a gruff rancher or a dusty cowhand." It wasn't quite hope that Evelyn felt in that moment. Not yet. But it was something close, a fragile, tentative thing that whispered, maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as alone as she'd thought. "Thank you," she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. "I promise I won't be a burden for long. I'll find work, I'll—" "Hush about that tonight," Mrs. Guthrie interrupted. "Tonight you eat and rest. Tomorrow's soon enough for plans." They finished the meal in more relaxed conversation. Mrs. Guthrie told stories about the ranch, about the handful of cowboys who worked the land, about the rhythms of life in the territory. Jack said less but listened attentively, occasionally adding a dry comment that made Mrs. Guthrie laugh. When the meal was done and the dishes cleared, Evelyn excused herself to her room. Exhaustion was finally catching up with her, bone-deep weariness that made every movement feel like wading through water. In the small bedroom, she changed into her nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed. Through the window, she could see stars, more stars than she'd ever seen in her life, scattered across the sky like diamonds spilled on black velvet. In Boston, the city lights had drowned out all but the brightest. Here, the night sky was alive. She thought of Uncle Thomas, dead 3 months and buried in this hard land. She thought of the letter that had promised her salvation. She thought of everything she'd lost and everything that had gone wrong. But she also thought of Jack Fletcher's steady gray-blue eyes, of Mrs. Guthrie's matter-of-fact kindness, of this room with its clean sheets and locked door, of stew and bread and the promise of tomorrow. Maybe the West wasn't salvation after all, but maybe, just maybe, it was a second chance. Evelyn blew out the lamp and lay down in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night. Somewhere outside, a coyote called. The wind whispered against the adobe walls. And in the quiet, beneath her fear and grief and uncertainty, she felt the first stirring of something that might, someday, become courage. She was alive. She was safe, at least for tonight. And tomorrow, she would begin to figure out what came next. Morning came soft and golden through the small window, painting stripes of light across the woven blanket. Evelyn woke slowly, disoriented at first by the unfamiliar room, the strange quality of silence that was somehow fuller than any quiet she'd known in Boston. Then memory returned in a rush. The empty train platform, the devastating news, Jack Fletcher's unexpected kindness. She sat up, her body protesting the long journey and the previous day's emotional toll, and listened to the sounds of the ranch coming to life outside. Voices carried from somewhere beyond her door, men's voices, rough and good-natured, calling to each other about horses and fences and the day's work. The smell of coffee drifted through the house, rich and strong. Somewhere closer, she could hear Mrs. Guthrie humming an old hymn, accompanied by the clatter of pots and pans. Evelyn dressed quickly in her simplest day dress, a gray cotton that had seen better days but was at least practical, and pinned her hair into a neat bun. When she emerged from her room, she found Mrs. Guthrie in the kitchen, flour dusting her apron as she worked dough on a wooden board. "Good morning, child," the older woman said without looking up. "There's coffee on the stove and biscuits in the oven. Help yourself? Jack's already out with the hands, checking the north pasture fence. Storm last week knocked a section down." Evelyn poured herself coffee in a thick ceramic mug and stood awkwardly in the doorway, uncertain of her place in this household. "Is there something I can do to help?" Mrs. Guthrie glanced up, her sharp eyes softening. "Not this morning. You're a guest, not a hired hand. Sit down, eat something. We'll talk after breakfast about going into town." "Town?" Evelyn's stomach tightened. "Why?" "Because Jack spoke to the sheriff last night after you'd gone to bed. Asked him to look into Thomas's property records. Sheriff's office opens at 9, and Jack wants to ride in with you, see what we can learn about your uncle's estate." Mrs. Guthrie shaped the dough into rounds with practiced efficiency. Best to know what you're dealing with sooner rather than later. The coffee was strong enough to strip paint, but Evelyn found it oddly comforting. She sat at the kitchen table and watched Mrs. Guthrie work, trying to imagine what they might find in Uncle Thomas's records. Property, he'd mentioned in his letter. Land. But how much, and in what condition? Mrs. Guthrie, she said carefully, may I ask you something? Of course. Jack said my uncle lived alone about 5 miles from here. Do you know why he never married? Why he stayed solitary? The older woman was quiet for a moment, sliding the biscuits into the oven before turning to face Evelyn. I didn't know Thomas as well as Jack did, but from what I understand, he came west after some kind of heartbreak back east. Lost love, maybe, or family trouble. He never spoke of it directly, but sometimes you could see it in his eyes, that faraway look people get when they're remembering something painful. He seemed content enough out here, though. Had his land, his routine. Came to town once a month for supplies, helped neighbors when they needed it, kept to himself otherwise. It sounded lonely to Evelyn, terribly lonely. Had Uncle Thomas been running from something just as she was? Had he found peace in this harsh territory, or just a place to hide? He talked about you, though, Mrs. Guthrie continued, pouring herself coffee and joining Evelyn at the table. Last time I saw him must have been 2 months before he passed. He mentioned his sister's daughter back in Boston. Said you were too smart and too kind for the life you'd been dealt. Said if he ever got the chance, he'd bring you out here, give you room to breathe and grow without all those society pressures crushing you down. The older woman's expression turned sad. Guess he finally worked up the courage to write that letter, but the fever took him before he could see it through. Tears pricked Evelyn's eyes. I wish I'd known him better. Well, maybe you'll get to know him through what he left behind. A man's property tells you a lot about who he was. They finished breakfast as the sun climbed higher, turning the desert from gold to white-hot brightness. When Jack returned from the pastures, dust-covered and already sweating despite the early hour, he found them cleaning up the kitchen. Miss Hart, he said, removing his hat in that automatic gesture of respect. If you're ready, I thought we'd head into town around 8:30. Give the sheriff time to get organized. Miss the worst of the heat on the ride back. Of course, I'll be ready. Evelyn hesitated. Mr. Fletcher, Jack, I want you to know how grateful I am. For everything. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't come to the station yesterday. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of discomfort at being thanked, perhaps, or simply the awkwardness of a man unused to emotional conversations. You'd have figured something out, I expect. You strike me as resourceful. I'm not sure I am, she admitted quietly, but I'm trying to be. His gray-blue eyes held hers for a long moment. Sometimes trying is all any of us can manage. That's enough. The ride into Whispering Creek was nothing like the previous evening's journey. In daylight, with a full stomach and a night's rest behind her, Evelyn could see the landscape more clearly. The desert wasn't just empty space, it was full of subtle color and movement, patches of scrub grass, weathered rock formations, the distant mountains sharp against the brilliant sky. Birds she couldn't name wheeled overhead. Once, Jack pointed out a roadrunner darting between cacti, its comical gait making Evelyn smile despite her nervousness about what they might discover in town. You said you fought in the war, she ventured after a while. Were you cavalry? Jack's hands tightened slightly on the reins. Infantry, mostly. Virginia campaigns, saw action at Petersburg, Appomattox, lost a lot of good men. The pain in his voice was old but still sharp. Evelyn understood that kind of pain, the kind that never quite healed, just scarred over and ached in the cold. I'm sorry, she said. War is a terrible thing. Yes, ma'am, it is. But it taught me something important, how to keep moving forward when everything's gone to hell. How to find solid ground when the world's shaking apart. He glanced at her. Skills that serve a man well out here. They reached Whispering Creek just before 9. In daylight, the town looked slightly less desperate than it had the previous evening, though not by much. The main street was busy with morning activity, wagons loading supplies, women with market baskets, men gathered outside the general store discussing weather and cattle prices. Evelyn felt eyes follow them as Jack helped her down from the wagon. felt the weight of curiosity and speculation. The sheriff's office sat between the bank and a barber shop, a squat adobe building with iron bars on the windows and a weathered sign over the door. Jack tied the horses and led Evelyn inside, where a man in his 50s looked up from a desk piled with papers. "Jack," the sheriff said, rising to shake hands. "Right on time. And this must be Miss Hart." "Sheriff Tom Wyatt. Meet Evelyn Hart, Thomas's niece from Boston." Jack's introduction was simple, but Evelyn caught the undercurrent of respect between the two men. Sheriff Wyatt had kind eyes and a weathered face, the look of a man who'd seen enough trouble to be cautious, but not enough to be cruel. "Miss Hart, I'm very sorry about your uncle. He was a good man and a law-abiding citizen. We'll miss him around here." "Thank you, Sheriff. I understand you've looked into his property records?" "I have indeed. Took me a bit of digging this morning, but I found everything." He gestured to two chairs facing his desk. "Please sit. This may take a few minutes to explain." Once they were settled, Sheriff Wyatt pulled a folder from the mess on his desk and opened it carefully. "Your uncle purchased 160 acres in 1867, about 8 years after he arrived in the territory. It's good land, valley property with a creek running through it, stands of cottonwood trees for shade and building material, decent grazing for cattle. He built himself a cabin there, ran a small operation. Never got rich, but he made a living." Evelyn's heart began to beat faster. "The land is part of his estate?" "It is, along with the cabin and whatever personal property was in it at the time of his death." The sheriff pulled out a document, official-looking with seals and signatures. "Thomas Hart left a will, filed it with the territorial court 2 years ago. Very simple document. He had no other family that he acknowledged, so everything passes to his sole surviving heir." He looked up, meeting Evelyn's eyes. "That's you, Miss Hart. You inherit the entire property." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Evelyn gripped the arms of her chair, trying to process what she'd just heard. "The entire property?" 160 acres, the cabin, all improvements, and any personal property therein. There's also," Sheriff Wyatt consulted another paper, "a bank account in Thomas's name at the Territorial Bank across the street. I don't have access to the exact amount, but the bank manager mentioned it yesterday when I inquired. Seems Thomas was careful with money, saved most of what he made over the years." "How much?" The question came out as barely a whisper. "You'll need to speak with the bank manager for specifics, but I understand it's a respectable sum. Enough to live on for a while, properly managed." Jack leaned forward. "Sheriff, has anyone been out to Thomas's place since he passed? To check on the property, secure it? I rode out there myself about a week after he died, made sure the cabin was locked up tight. Haven't been back since. No reason to, and I've been dealing with rustlers in the southern part of the territory. But as far as I know, everything should be as Thomas left it." Evelyn's mind was racing. Land, a cabin, money, the things Uncle Thomas had promised in his letter. They were real. They existed. She wasn't destitute. She wasn't helpless. She had property, had assets, had the foundation for an actual life here. "I'd like to see it," she said suddenly. "The property, my uncle's cabin. Can we go there?" Sheriff Wyatt nodded. "That's your right as the new owner. I can give you directions. It's not hard to find. About 5 miles east of Jack's ranch, in a valley between 2 ridges. Follow the creek from the main road and you'll run right into it." Jack turned to Evelyn. "We could ride out there this afternoon if you'd like. Get a sense of what you're inheriting." "Yes, please. I need to see it." She needed to understand what Uncle Thomas had built, what he'd meant to give her. Needed to see the place where he'd lived and died. This uncle she'd barely known who'd tried to save her from an ocean away. "Then we'll do that," Jack said quietly. "But first, let's stop at the bank. You should know exactly what your financial situation is." The Territorial Bank was a more substantial building than most in Whispering Creek. 2 stories of brick with painted letters on the window, advertising loans and savings accounts. Inside, it was cool and dim, with a high ceiling and the hushed atmosphere of a place where money was taken seriously. The bank manager, a nervous man with spectacles and thinning hair, recognized Jack immediately. "Mr. Fletcher, good morning. And this must be Miss Evelyn Hart, Thomas Hart's niece and heir. She needs to discuss her uncle's account." The manager's demeanor shifted to something more formal, more careful. Of course. Miss Hart, please come to my office. I'll need to verify your identity and have you sign some documents, but we can certainly discuss your late uncle's financial arrangements. The office was small but tidy, with a desk, 2 chairs, and a large safe in the corner. The manager, Mr. Pemberton, according to the nameplate on his desk, pulled out a ledger and ran his finger down a column of entries. Your uncle maintained a savings account with us for nearly 15 years, he said. He made regular deposits, not large amounts, but consistent, very disciplined with his money. Let me see, he adjusted his spectacles, peering at the numbers. The current balance is $842. Evelyn's breath caught. $842. It was more money than she'd ever had in her life, more than she'd imagined possible. With careful management, it was enough to live on for years. Are you certain? She asked faintly. Quite certain, Miss Hart. And with the land value, 160 acres of decent valley property is worth at least $1,000, possibly more. You're looking at assets totaling somewhere between $1,800 and $2,000. That's a considerable inheritance for this territory. $1,800, $2,000. The numbers seemed almost fictional. Yesterday, she'd had $3.70 and no prospects. Today, she was a woman of property. What do I need to do to access the account? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. I'll need proof of identity and the death certificate, which Sheriff Wyatt has filed with the territorial court. Once I verify those documents, I can transfer the account into your name. The process usually takes a day or 2. In the meantime, I can advance you a small amount if you need immediate funds. That won't be necessary, Jack interjected. Miss Hart is staying at my ranch while she gets her affairs in order. She has no immediate need for cash. Mr. Pemberton nodded, making notes in his ledger. Very good. Miss Hart, if you can return tomorrow or the next day, I should have everything prepared for your signature. When they emerged from the bank back into the bright morning sunlight, Evelyn felt dizzy. The street seemed too bright, too loud, too real. She stood on the wooden sidewalk, one hand against the building's brick wall, trying to understand that her life had just transformed in the space of an hour. You all right? Jack's voice was gentle, concerned. I don't know, she admitted. I came here expecting nothing, and instead I have land and money and… She couldn't finish the sentence. A future, Jack supplied. You have a future, Miss Hart. That's what Thomas wanted to give you. The tears came then, unexpected and overwhelming. Evelyn turned away, embarrassed to cry in public, but Jack simply handed her his handkerchief and stood between her and the street, giving her privacy while she composed herself. I'm sorry, she gasped. I'm not normally. You've had a hell of 2 days, Jack said quietly. Crying's allowed. She wiped her eyes and took a shaky breath. Can we see the property now? I need to understand what this means. We can. But Miss Hart, Evelyn, you should know something first. Jack's expression was serious. The cabin's been sitting empty for 3 months. I don't know what condition it'll be in. And valley property means it's isolated. You'd be living alone out there 5 miles from my place, 10 from town. That's hard even for folks born to this territory. Are you suggesting I shouldn't live there? I'm suggesting you don't have to decide anything today. You've got options now. You could sell the property, use the money to set yourself up in town. You could hire someone to work the land while you live somewhere safer. Or you could stay at my ranch as long as you need while you figure out what you want. He held her gaze. Having property doesn't mean you have to prove anything to anyone. But Evelyn shook her head. I want to see it. I need to see what he meant for me to have. The ride east from Whispering Creek took them through terrain that gradually shifted from open desert to something slightly greener. Jack guided the wagon along a rutted track that followed a creek, just a trickle of water now in late summer, but enough to sustain cottonwood trees that grew along its banks. The shade was a blessed relief from the brutal sun. Your uncle chose his spot well, Jack commented as they drove. Water year-round, trees for building and firewood, protected from the worst winds by those ridges. It's good ranching country. Not as good as mine, maybe, but good. Evelyn smiled at his dry humor. You're very confident about your ranch. I've worked 8 years to make it what it is. A man's allowed some pride in his accomplishments. They rounded a bend in the creek, and suddenly there it was. A valley opening up before them, surprisingly green after the harsh desert they'd crossed. Cottonwood trees clustered thick along the water. Grass grew in patches where the ground stayed moist. And there, nestled against the base of a low ridge, stood a cabin. It was small, probably just 1 or 2 rooms, built of logs chinked with mud, with a stone chimney rising from one end. The roof looked intact, though the front porch sagged slightly. A small corral stood empty nearby, its fence weathered but still standing. Behind the cabin, Evelyn could see what looked like a garden plot, overgrown now, but still visible. Jack pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the cabin. The silence was profound. Just the whisper of wind through cottonwood leaves, the distant call of a bird, the soft gurgle of the creek. No other human sounds for miles. "It's beautiful," Evelyn breathed. "It's isolated," Jack countered, though not unkindly. "Nearest neighbor is me, and I'm 5 miles west. Town's 10 miles. If something happened, if you got hurt or sick, there'd be no one to help. But it's mine." She climbed down from the wagon without waiting for assistance, drawn toward the cabin like iron to a lodestone. This was his. Now it's mine. The front door was locked, but Jack produced a key. "Sheriff gave it to me this morning," and opened it. The hinges protested with a rusty squeal. Inside, the cabin was dim and dusty, but Evelyn could see immediately that Uncle Thomas had lived here with care. One large room served as both living quarters and kitchen, with a smaller bedroom partitioned off at the back. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cooking crane still in place. Simple furniture: a table, 2 chairs, a rocking chair. Shelves built into the walls. Everything was covered in dust, but underneath, Evelyn could see order. Books on the shelves, cooking implements hung neatly near the hearth, a braided rug on the floor. She moved through the space slowly, running her fingers along the table's edge, opening cupboards to find dishes and dry goods still stored inside. In the bedroom, a simple bed frame with a straw mattress, a trunk at its foot, a small desk beneath the window. "He lived simply," Jack said from the doorway, not entering the bedroom out of respect for her privacy. "But well, everything a man needs, nothing he doesn't." Evelyn opened the trunk. Inside she found clothes, work shirts and trousers, a good suit wrapped in paper that smelled of cedar, a Bible with notes in the margins, a bundle of letters tied with string, and at the very bottom a small wooden box. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out and opened the lid. Inside was a tintype photograph, a young couple, the woman bearing such a strong resemblance to Evelyn's mother that she gasped. Uncle Thomas and his sister then, her mother, taken before Evelyn was born, when they were both young, and the future must have seemed full of possibility. Beneath the photograph were more papers. Evelyn carried the box to the desk and began sorting through them by the light from the window. Property deeds. There they were, official and legal, confirming what Sheriff Wyatt had told her. The will, a copy filed with the court. Letters from Boston, old ones dating back years. And then at the bottom of the box, she found it, a small leather pouch, heavy in her hand. She loosened the drawstring and poured the contents onto the desk. Gold coins clinked and rolled, $20 pieces, bright and heavy. She counted them quickly. 30 coins, $600 in gold, hidden away in case of emergency. "Jack," she called, her voice shaking. "Jack, you need to see this." He came to the bedroom doorway, stopping just at the threshold. When he saw the gold coins gleaming on the desk, his eyebrows rose. Well, Thomas was more careful than even I knew. "That's almost $1,500 in the bank and in gold," Evelyn said, doing the math in her head. "Plus the land. Jack, I'm not just not destitute, I'm comfortable, more than comfortable." "You're independent," Jack corrected. "That's what Thomas wanted for you, the ability to make your own choices, live your own life." Evelyn sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed. Through the window, she could see the valley stretching away, the creek glinting in the sunlight, the cottonwoods swaying gently. Her valley, her property, her future. "I could live here," she said softly. "I could actually make a life here." Jack's expression was carefully neutral. "You could, but that's not a decision to make lightly. Like I said, it's isolated. Hard country for anyone, harder for a woman alone. What would I need? She turned to face him, her mind already racing ahead. To make this place livable again, to work the land properly. He considered for a moment. Supplies first: food, lamp oil, firewood for winter. The cabin needs work. That porch should be reinforced, the chinking between the logs checked and repaired. You'd need livestock if you wanted to run cattle, or chickens at least for eggs. Seeds for the garden come spring. And honestly, you'd need help. Someone to do the heavy work, handle repairs, maybe a woman to live here with you for propriety's sake. That sounds expensive. Some of it would be, but not all. Folks around here help each other out. Barn raisings, fence mending, that sort of thing. And you've got money to hire what help you need. Jack leaned against the doorframe. The real question is whether you want this life. It's not Boston, Evelyn. It's not easy. The winters are hard, the summer's brutal. You'd be working from dawn to dusk just to keep things running, and you'd be alone most of the time. Evelyn looked around the small bedroom, imagining Uncle Thomas sitting at this desk, writing the letter that had brought her here. He'd built this place with his own hands. He'd lived here alone for years, carved out a life from harsh territory. And he'd wanted to give it to her, not as a burden, but as a gift. The gift of independence, of choice, of a future she could shape herself. I want to try, she said quietly. Not forever, maybe, but I want to try. I want to understand what Uncle Thomas saw in this place, why he stayed. Something shifted in Jack's expression, respect perhaps, or understanding. All right then. But you're not doing it alone, not at first. You'll stay at my ranch while we get this place ready for you. Mrs. Guthrie and I will help. So will my ranch hands. We'll fix what needs fixing, stock what needs stocking, and make sure you've got everything you need before you move in. Agreed? I can pay. I'm not asking for payment. I'm offering neighborly help, same as Thomas would have done for me. Same as I hope you'd do for me if situations were reversed. Evelyn's throat tightened. You're a good man, Jack Fletcher. I'm a man who honors his debts, Jack replied, and I owed Thomas Hart more than I can ever repay. Helping his niece is the least I can do. They spent another hour at the cabin taking inventory of what was there and what would be needed. Evelyn found more of Uncle Thomas's personal effects. His clothes, his books, a journal filled with notes about weather and cattle prices and the slow passage of seasons. She found letters he'd written but never sent, including one addressed to her, dated just a week before he died. She opened it with shaking hands and read by the fading afternoon light streaming through the window. The letter was short, written in Uncle Thomas's careful script. My dear Evelyn, by the time you read this, I will have sent you a letter asking you to come west. I hope you will accept. The territory is hard, but it is honest, and there is room here for a woman to be more than society allows back east. I have built a small life in this valley, simple, but mine. I hope to share it with you, to give you the space and freedom to discover who you might become without the crushing weight of propriety and judgment. If circumstances prevent us from meeting, if time or fate intervenes, know that this place is yours. The land, the cabin, everything I have built. Use it as you see fit. Build a life here, or sell it and build a life elsewhere. The choice is yours, and that is the greatest gift I can offer. Your loving uncle, Thomas. Evelyn folded the letter carefully, her vision blurred with tears. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known he might not survive to see her arrival, and he'd made provisions anyway. Had left her not just property, but the means to determine her own future. Thank you, she whispered to the empty room, to the uncle she'd never really known. Thank you for understanding what I needed. When they finally locked up the cabin and climbed back into the wagon for the ride back to Jack's ranch, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. Evelyn sat quietly, processing everything she'd learned, everything that had changed in just 2 days. She'd arrived in Arizona territory expecting to find family and had instead found death. But she'd also found unexpected kindness, a home she could claim as her own, and the possibility of a future she'd never dared imagine. As the wagon rolled along the creek track, Jack broke the comfortable silence. You're thinking hard over there. Evelyn smiled. I'm trying to understand how my life turned around so completely. Yesterday, I had nothing. Today, I have everything. You have possibilities, Jack corrected. What you do with them, that's still up to you. What would you do if you were in my position? He considered for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. I'd take it slow. Live at the ranch for a while, get to know the territory, understand what you're getting into before you commit to the valley. And I'd ask myself honestly what kind of life I wanted: solitude or community, hard work or easier paths. There's no wrong answer, but you should be clear about what you're choosing. What did you choose? Evelyn asked. When you came here? I chose the hard work, chose the solitude, at least at first. After the war, I needed space to put myself back together. The ranch gave me that. But I was running from things, Evelyn. You don't strike me as someone who runs, you strike me as someone who faces things head on, even when it's hard. I ran from Boston, she pointed out. Did you? Or did you survive Boston and come west looking for something better? The distinction felt important, though Evelyn couldn't quite articulate why. She thought about Randall's betrayal, about the scandal that had ruined her reputation, about Aunt Millicent's cold dismissal. She'd left, yes, but not out of cowardice. She'd left because there was nothing left for her there. She'd left to find something new. I came looking for a chance, she said finally. Uncle Thomas offered me one in his letter. I didn't expect to find it this way, but here it is. Here it is, Jack agreed. They reached the ranch as the sky turned gold and amber, the day's heat finally beginning to ease. Mrs. Guthrie met them at the door, her expression anxious until she saw Evelyn's face. Good news, I take it? The older woman asked. The best, Evelyn confirmed. I have property, money, a future. Mrs. Guthrie's face split into a wide smile. Well, praise be. That calls for a proper celebration. I've got a roast in the oven and fresh pie cooling. You'll tell me everything over supper. That evening, seated around the kitchen table with Jack and Mrs. Guthrie, Evelyn recounted the day's discoveries: the will, the bank account, the gold coins hidden in Uncle Thomas's cabin. Mrs. Guthrie listened with the keen interest of someone who genuinely cared, asking questions and offering advice with the wisdom of long experience. The valley property is good land, she confirmed. Thomas chose well. With some work and the right help, you could make a real go of it there. That's assuming she wants to make a go of it, Jack interjected. She's got money now. She could do anything. But what I want to do, Evelyn said slowly, the realization forming even as she spoke, is understand what Uncle Thomas built, why he chose this life. I want to try, at least. Give it an honest attempt before I decide what comes next. Mrs. Guthrie reached across the table and patted her hand. That's a brave choice, child, and you won't be alone in it. We'll help however we can. Later, after the dishes were washed and Mrs. Guthrie had retired to her own small cottage behind the main house, Evelyn found herself once again on the porch, looking out at the star-filled desert night. She heard the door open behind her and knew, without turning, that it was Jack. Can't sleep? He asked, joining her at the porch rail. Too much to think about, too many changes too fast. They stood in companionable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the ranch, horses moving in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote, the whisper of wind through the darkness. Jack, Evelyn said finally, why did you really come for me yesterday? The whole truth. He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, I told you about Samuel Carter, the man who gave me this ranch. He died about 5 years ago. In his last days, he told me something I've never forgotten. He said the measure of a man isn't what he builds for himself, but what he does for others when there's nothing in it for him. When I heard Thomas's niece had arrived from Boston with nowhere to go, I thought about that. Thought about what Thomas would have wanted, what Samuel would have wanted, and I knew what I had to do. You're honoring them. I'm trying to live up to what they taught me. Might not always succeed, but I figure trying is what matters. Evelyn turned to face him, this quiet, honorable man who'd become her unexpected savior. You've given me more than you know, not just shelter and help, but hope. I came here thinking I'd lost everything, and instead I found... She trailed off, not quite sure how to finish. A second chance, Jack supplied softly. Same as I found when Samuel took me in. Same as Thomas wanted to give you. The territory's hard, Evelyn, but it's honest. And sometimes hard and honest is exactly what a person needs to figure out who they really are. Looking into his storm cloud eyes, Evelyn felt something shift inside her chest. A recognition, perhaps, of kinship. They were both survivors, both rebuilding their lives from ruins, both learning to trust again after betrayal and loss. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Jack's expression softened. "You're welcome. Now get some rest. Tomorrow we start getting your uncle's place ready. It's going to be a lot of work." But as Evelyn finally returned to her small bedroom and lay down in the darkness, she found she wasn't afraid of hard work. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt the stirring of something that might, eventually, become joy. She had land, she had money, she had help from people who asked nothing in return, and she had time to heal, time to grow, time to discover who Evelyn Hart might become in this vast, hard, honest territory. Outside, the desert wind whispered promises through the cottonwood trees, and somewhere in the darkness, the future waited to be shaped by willing hands. The next morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost harsh after the emotional turbulence of the previous days. Evelyn woke to the sound of hammering and male voices calling to each other outside her window. She dressed quickly and emerged to find Jack already organizing his ranch hands for the day's work. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat as she approached. "I've got 3 men who can spare the day to ride out to your uncle's place. We'll start on the porch repairs and check the roof for leaks. Mrs. Guthrie's packing supplies. Figured we'd take enough to get the cabin stocked for basic living." The casual efficiency of it took Evelyn's breath away. These men didn't know her, owed her nothing, yet they were giving up a day's work on their own ranch to help her. "I should pay them for their time." "They're on my payroll," Jack said firmly, "and they're doing this because I asked. Don't insult them by offering money." One of the ranch hands, a lanky young man with sun-bleached hair, grinned at her. "Ma'am, your uncle was good to all of us at one time or another. My pa's horse went lame about 3 years back, left him stranded. Mr. Hart rode past, gave him water and his own horse to get home. Wouldn't take payment, just said pass it forward. Well, this is us passing it forward." Evelyn felt her throat tighten. "What's your name?" "Billy Crane, ma'am, and these are my brothers, Sam and Will." He gestured to 2 other young men loading tools into a wagon. They had the same sun-weathered look, the same open friendliness. "Thank you, Billy, all of you. I don't know what to say." "Don't need to say nothing," Sam called from the wagon. "Just make good use of that property. Your uncle would want that." The ride out to the valley took on a different character with the wagon full of supplies and 4 horses trailing behind. Jack had brought lumber for repairs, tools, lanterns, rope, and what seemed like half the contents of his own storehouse. Mrs. Guthrie had insisted on coming along, her wagon loaded with food stores, linens, and cleaning supplies. "A house needs a woman's touch to become a home," she'd declared, "and that cabin's been sitting empty too long. Time to wake it up." When they arrived at Uncle Thomas's property, the morning sun was painting the valley in shades of gold and green. The cottonwoods rustled in a light breeze, and the creek sang its quiet song over smooth stones. In the daylight, with purpose ahead of them, the cabin looked less like a monument to loss and more like a promise waiting to be fulfilled. Jack immediately set the Crane brothers to work on the porch, their hammers soon ringing out in steady rhythm. He climbed onto the roof himself, checking each shingle, testing the chimney stones. Mrs. Guthrie swept through the cabin like a force of nature, opening windows to air out the mustiness, beating dust from the rug, organizing what needed to be kept and what needed to be discarded. Evelyn found herself drawn to the bedroom, to Uncle Thomas's personal effects. She went through them methodically, sorting clothes into piles. Some could be saved, others were too worn. The books on the shelves were treasures, their margins filled with her uncle's notes and observations. She found a journal tucked behind the others, its leather cover soft with age. Sitting at the small desk, she opened it carefully. The first entry was dated 1867, the year Uncle Thomas had purchased the property. His handwriting was precise, almost formal, as if he were recording history for someone who would read it later. April 15th, 1867. Purchased 160 acres in the valley by the creek. The land speaks to me in ways Boston never did. Here, a man can build something true. Here, the only judgment comes from whether the work is honest and the effort genuine. I will make a life in this place. I will become someone my sister would be proud of, even if she never sees what I've built. Evelyn's eyes blurred. She turned pages, reading snapshots of her uncle's life, entries about building the cabin log by log, about planting his first garden and watching it thrive, about long nights alone when the silence felt overwhelming and he questioned his choices, about slowly finding peace in the rhythm of the seasons, in the hard work of survival, in the vast indifference of the desert that somehow felt more honest than the judgmental streets of Boston. One entry, dated 3 years ago, mentioned her directly. Received a letter from Millicent today. She writes that my niece Evelyn has suffered a scandal, betrayed by a man she trusted, cast out by society for speaking truth when lies were more convenient. My heart breaks for her. I remember my own scandal, my own exile. I remember how Boston crushed me beneath the weight of propriety and expectation. I should write to her. I should offer her what I wish someone had offered me, a place to start over, to discover who she might be without the chains of society's approval. But am I being selfish? Is this harsh territory any place for a refined young woman? I must consider carefully. So he'd known. He'd known about Randall's betrayal, about the scandal, about everything. And he'd waited, considered, and finally decided to offer her sanctuary. The letter that had brought her west hadn't been impulsive. It had been deliberate, thought through, a lifeline thrown with full understanding of what she was fleeing. "Thank you," Evelyn whispered to the journal, to the uncle who'd understood her pain because he'd lived through his own. "Thank you for seeing me, for knowing what I needed." "Miss Hart?" Mrs. Guthrie's voice called from the main room. "Come look at what we found." Evelyn set the journal aside carefully and went to see what the older woman had discovered. Mrs. Guthrie was kneeling by the hearth where she'd moved aside the iron cooking crane to clean behind it. In the space where the crane had hung, someone had built a small shelf into the stone, hidden from casual view. "Your uncle was a careful man," Mrs. Guthrie said, reaching into the space. "Careful and clever." She pulled out a wooden box about the size of a book. It was locked, but the key was tied to the handle with a piece of string, hidden but accessible to anyone who knew to look. Mrs. Guthrie handed it to Evelyn without opening it. "Some things should be opened in private," she said gently. Evelyn carried the box back to the bedroom, her heart pounding. She untied the key with trembling fingers and unlocked the box. Inside were more papers, deeds and documents she'd already seen copies of in the trunk, but there were also personal items. A lock of dark hair tied with faded ribbon, a woman's handkerchief embroidered with the initials MC, a small portrait of a young woman Evelyn didn't recognize, and beneath everything, another letter, this one addressed simply to my heir. Evelyn unfolded it, recognizing her uncle's handwriting even before she began to read. "To whoever inherits this property, if you're reading this, I am gone. I hope it was quick. I've lived long enough to know that a slow death in lonely territory is a hard fate, and I pray I was spared that. If you are my niece Evelyn, know that everything here is yours by intention, not accident. I have watched from afar as life treated you harshly. I have wished I could offer comfort, but was too much a coward to reach out until it was nearly too late. This property, this valley, this simple life, it is my attempt to give you what I found here. Not wealth, not status, but freedom. The freedom to define yourself by your own standards, not society's. The freedom to fail and succeed on your own terms. The freedom to be exactly who you are without apology." The woman in the portrait was Margaret Cole. We were engaged to be married in 1854. Her family discovered I had debts I had hidden from them. Small debts, easily paid, but in their eyes a moral failing that made me unworthy of their daughter. They forbade the marriage. Margaret chose her family over me, and I was cast out of Boston society. I came west broken, angry, certain I would never find peace. But I did find peace eventually, in the hard work of building this cabin, in the honest sweat of working land that asked nothing of me but effort. In the slow understanding that society's judgment meant nothing out here, where a man was measured by his actions, not his connections. If you choose to keep this property, know that you are choosing a hard life. Winters are brutal. Summers are merciless. The work never ends. You will be lonely. You will be tired. You will question your choice 1,000 times, but you will also be free. And freedom, I have learned, is worth any price. Build a good life here, whoever you are. Honor this land with honest effort, and remember that the only person you need to prove anything to is yourself. Thomas Hart, October 1874. Evelyn read the letter twice, then a third time, tears streaming down her face. Margaret Cole. A broken engagement. A scandal not so different from her own. Uncle Thomas hadn't just understood her pain abstractly. He'd lived it. He'd survived it, and he'd found a way forward. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the box with the other mementos. Then she stood, wiped her eyes, and went to the window. Outside, she could see Jack on the roof, moving with sure-footed confidence as he replaced damaged shingles. The Crane brothers had finished the porch, and were now working on the corral fence. Mrs. Guthrie was hanging curtains in the main room, transforming the dusty space into something that looked lived in, cared for. These people barely knew her. They had their own lives, their own struggles. Yet they were here, working in the hot sun, helping her claim this inheritance, not because they expected payment or praise, but because it was simply what neighbors did in this territory. Because Uncle Thomas had been a good man who'd helped others, and they were honoring that memory by helping his niece. Evelyn made a decision in that moment, standing at her uncle's bedroom window, looking out at her valley. She would stay. She would make a life here. Not forever, perhaps. She didn't know enough yet to promise forever. But for now. For long enough to understand what Uncle Thomas had found in this harsh, honest place. For long enough to discover who Evelyn Hart might become without Boston's crushing weight on her shoulders. She returned to the main room to find Mrs. Guthrie surveying her work with satisfaction. The cabin had transformed in just a few hours. Clean curtains framed the windows. The floor had been swept and scrubbed. The furniture, simple but sturdy, was arranged to make the small space feel open and welcoming. Supplies lined the shelves: flour, coffee, sugar, beans, salt pork, dried fruit. "It's starting to look like a home," Mrs. Guthrie said. "Still needs more work. The bedroom needs a proper mattress. The kitchen could use better organization. But it's a start." "It's wonderful," Evelyn said honestly. "I can't thank you enough." "Thank me by making good use of it. That's all Thomas would want." The older woman dusted off her apron. "Now, I've been thinking about your situation. You can't live out here alone, not right away. It wouldn't be proper, and more importantly, it wouldn't be safe. You need to know this territory, understand how to survive here before you strike out on your own." "I know," Jack said the same thing. Jack's right, irritating as it is to admit. Mrs. Guthrie smiled. "Here's what I propose. You stay at the ranch for a few more weeks, maybe a month. During that time, you come out here regularly, help with the work, learn the land, understand what you're getting into. We'll get the cabin fully stocked and repaired. Come October, when the worst heat breaks, you can move in if you still want to, and I'll come stay with you for the first month or so, help you establish routines, make sure you're managing all right. After that, we'll see." The offer was so generous, so thoughtful, that Evelyn found herself speechless. "You do that? Leave your own home to stay here with me?" "Child, I've been keeping house for Cowboys and doing laundry for 8 years. A change of scenery sounds downright appealing. Besides, I like you. You've got spine. And Lord knows this territory needs women with spine." Mrs. Guthrie's expression grew serious. "But you need to understand something. If you're going to make a go of this place, you can't do it as a lady from Boston playing at frontier life. You'll need to learn skills: how to shoot, how to ride properly, how to preserve food, how to doctor animals and yourself, how to read weather and understand when a storm's coming, how to be alone without going mad from the silence. It's hard work and harder learning, but if you're willing, I'll teach you." "I'm willing," Evelyn said without hesitation. "I want to learn. I need to learn." "Good. Then we'll start tomorrow. Jack can teach you shooting and riding. I'll handle the rest: cooking over a fire, preserving and smoking meat, tending a garden, all the practical skills a woman needs out here." The sound of boots on the newly repaired porch announced Jack's arrival. He ducked through the doorway, his shirt damp with sweat, dust in his hair. Roof's solid. Should last another 10 years easy. Found a few weak spots in the chimney stones, but the Crane boys are mortaring them now. This is good property, Evelyn. Your uncle built well. He did, she agreed softly, and I intend to honor that. Jack studied her face, seeming to read the decision there. You're planning to stay. To really stay. I'm planning to try. Mrs. Guthrie's offered to help me learn what I need to know, and I've accepted. Something shifted in Jack's expression. Approval, maybe, or respect. It won't be easy. I don't expect easy. I expect honest. That's what Uncle Thomas promised in his letter, and it's what I need. They worked through the afternoon as the sun climbed high and hot. The Crane brothers finished the corral fence and started on clearing the overgrown garden plot, turning soil that had lain fallow for 3 months. Jack made notes on a piece of paper listing supplies still needed. A new mattress, more lamp oil, tools for the garden, ammunition for the rifle he'd found in Uncle Thomas's closet. Mrs. Guthrie organized the kitchen with ruthless efficiency, making lists of her own about what staples needed replenishing and what recipes Evelyn would need to learn. By late afternoon, when the heat became too brutal for outdoor work, they gathered in the cabin's relative cool to eat the lunch Mrs. Guthrie had packed. Simple food, bread and cheese, dried meat, apples, but it tasted perfect after hours of physical labor. Miss Hart, Billy Crane said between bites, when you do move out here, you'll need livestock. A milk cow at least, some chickens, maybe a few beef cattle if you want to run a small herd. My pa's got extras he could sell cheap if you're interested. I appreciate that, Billy. Once I'm settled, I'll speak with him. Evelyn paused. And please, call me Evelyn. If we're going to be neighbors, we should be on friendly terms. The three brothers exchanged glances, and Sam spoke up. That's kind of you, Ma, Evelyn. But folks around here are particular about respect. You're a property owner now. That means something. Don't be surprised if people keep their distance at first, want to see what kind of neighbor you'll be before they get familiar. It was a warning, gently given. Evelyn understood what they weren't saying directly. She was an outsider, Eastern, educated, a woman alone. The local community would judge her by how she managed her property, how she handled the hardships, whether she asked for help too often or refused it too stubbornly. She would need to prove herself before she'd be truly accepted. I understand, she said. I'll earn their respect, not expect it. Jack had been quiet during this exchange, but now he spoke. You've got an advantage most newcomers don't. Your uncle was well liked. People will give you the benefit of the doubt because of him. But Sam's right. You'll need to prove you're not just some Eastern lady playing at ranching. This territory doesn't suffer fools or dilettantes. Then I won't be either, Evelyn said firmly. After lunch, while the men returned to their work outside, Evelyn continued exploring the cabin's contents. In the small root cellar beneath a trap door in the main room, she found preserved foods, jars of vegetables and fruit that Uncle Thomas had put up himself. Most were too old to be safe, but the discovery gave her ideas. She could learn canning, preserving, could grow her own food and put it up for winter, could become self-sufficient in ways that would have been unthinkable in Boston, where everything came from markets and shops. She found Uncle Thomas's rifle, an old Spencer repeater carefully maintained and wrapped in oiled cloth. She'd never held a gun in her life, but she understood instinctively that she'd need to learn. In this territory, a rifle wasn't just for hunting, it was for protection. From what, she wasn't entirely sure yet. Wild animals, certainly, but also from the possibility of dangerous men, rustlers, drifters. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like a challenge. Late in the afternoon, Jack found her in the garden plot, where she'd been pulling weeds from the overgrown beds. We should head back to the ranch soon. Don't want to be riding in full dark. Evelyn straightened, wiping sweat from her forehead. Her dress was dusty, her hands dirty, and she'd never felt more alive. Can we come back tomorrow? I want to keep working. We can come back as often as you like, but tomorrow, I think you should learn to shoot. Can't have you living out here if you don't know how to handle a rifle. I'd like that. They locked up the cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. The valley looked different now, not just beautiful, but purposeful. This was working land that could sustain her if she learned how to work with it. As they loaded into the wagons for the ride back, Evelyn took one last look at the cabin, already planning her return. The ride back to Jack's ranch was quieter than the morning journey. Everyone was tired, satisfied with the day's work. The Crane brothers rode ahead, talking among themselves. Mrs. Guthrie dozed in her wagon seat. Jack and Evelyn brought up the rear, the silence between them comfortable. "You worked hard today," Jack observed. "It felt good, purposeful." Evelyn glanced at him. "In Boston, I spent my days making social calls, doing needlework, attending teas and parties that meant nothing. I was ornamental, useless. Here, I pulled weeds and scrubbed floors and felt like I accomplished something real. There's plenty of real work ahead if you're serious about this life." "I'm serious." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Jack, can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "When you first came to the territory, when Samuel Carter took you in, were you afraid?" Jack was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. Then, "Terrified. I'd seen things in the war, done things, that I couldn't make peace with. I was angry all the time, drinking too much, picking fights. Samuel saw through all that to something worth saving, though I'll never understand what. He put me to work, hard, exhausting work that left me too tired to think at night. And slowly, over months and years, the work healed what the war had broken. Not completely, some things don't heal completely, but enough to keep living." "That's what I hope to find," Evelyn said softly. "Not healing exactly, but purpose. A reason to wake up that's about more than just surviving another day." "You'll find it," Jack said with quiet certainty. "This territory has a way of stripping everything down to what's essential, forces you to figure out what really matters." When they reached the ranch, the sky was painted in spectacular colors, orange and pink and deep purple. The Crane brothers said their goodbyes and rode off toward their own place. Mrs. Guthrie immediately disappeared into the kitchen to start supper. Jack helped Evelyn down from the wagon, his calloused hand steadying her. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked. "For the shooting lesson?" "Yes. And Jack, thank you. For today, for everything. I know I keep saying it, but I don't know how else to express what this means to me. You're honoring Thomas's memory by working hard and taking this seriously. That's thanks enough." He tipped his hat and turned toward the barn, leaving Evelyn standing in the gathering dusk. That night, after another of Mrs. Guthrie's hearty meals, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with Uncle Thomas's journal, reading by lamplight. She'd asked permission to bring it back to the ranch, wanting to understand more of the man who'd given her this gift. Mrs. Guthrie sat nearby, mending clothes, her needle flashing in the warm light. "He wrote about you once," Evelyn said, reading an entry from several years earlier. He says, "Mrs. Guthrie brought fresh bread today and lectured me about keeping the cabin cleaner. She's right, of course. She usually is. I'm grateful for her friendship, though I suspect she finds me a difficult case." Mrs. Guthrie laughed. "He was a difficult case, stubborn as a mule when he wanted to be, but kind. Always kind, even when he was being stubborn." Her expression softened. "He talked about you too, you know. In his last weeks, before the fever took hold bad, he said if he could just live long enough to see you settled here, to know you were safe and had a future, he could die content." Evelyn's vision blurred. "I wish I'd known him." "Well, you'll know him through his property, through what he built. That's a kind of knowing, isn't it? Seeing what a man valued, how he spent his time and energy." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the scratch of Mrs. Guthrie's needle and the distant call of a night bird. Then Mrs. Guthrie set aside her mending and looked at Evelyn seriously. "Child, I need to know something. Are you running away from Boston or running toward something here?" The question was direct, almost harsh, but Evelyn appreciated the honesty. "Both, maybe? I'm running from a life that was suffocating me, from people who valued appearances over truth, but I'm also running toward the possibility of something better, something real." "That's a good answer, because if you were just running away, you'd fail here. This territory doesn't care about what you're escaping from. It only cares about what you're willing to build. Can you do that? Can you look forward instead of back?" Evelyn thought about Randall, about the scandal, about Aunt Millicent's cold dismissal. The memories still hurt, still carried weight, but they no longer felt like the most important thing about her. They were becoming just part of her story, not the whole of it. "I can try," she said. "That's all I can promise. I can try." "Trying's enough," Mrs. Guthrie said, echoing Jack's words from the previous night. "Trying's always enough in this territory." The next morning dawned clear and hot. After breakfast, Jack led Evelyn away from the ranch buildings to a small canyon where the walls would contain sound. He carried her uncle's Spencer rifle and a box of ammunition. "First thing you need to understand," he said, setting the rifle down carefully, "is that a gun is a tool. Nothing more, nothing less. It's not magic. It's not good or evil. It's simply a means to an end, putting food on the table or protecting yourself if necessary. You respect it the same way you'd respect an axe or a knife. Understand?" "I understand." "Good. Now before we even load this thing, I want you to get comfortable holding it." He picked up the rifle and showed her how to grip it properly, how to sight down the barrel, how to brace the stock against her shoulder. Then he handed it to her. The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, awkward in her inexperienced hands. Jack stood behind her, adjusting her grip, positioning her feet for better balance. She could feel the heat of him, smell leather and soap, and something else that was just distinctly him. "Like this," he said, his voice close to her ear. "Firm, but not tense. The rifle shouldn't control you. You control it." They spent an hour on basic handling before Jack even showed her how to load it. He taught her how to check if it was loaded, how to engage and disengage the safety, how to clear a jam. When he finally let her load 5 rounds and take aim at a target he'd set up, an old bottle on a fence post about 30 yards away, she was trembling with nervous energy. "Breathe," Jack instructed. "Take your time. Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it. And expect the kick. It's going to surprise you the first time." Evelyn sighted down the barrel, lined up the target as Jack had shown her, and squeezed. The rifle roared and bucked against her shoulder, the impact shocking even though she'd been warned. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust several feet from the target. "Again," Jack said calmly. She fired 4 more times. The last shot clipped the edge of the fence post, sending splinters flying, not a hit, but closer. "You're flinching right before you fire," Jack observed, anticipating the kick. "You need to trust your aim and follow through. Let's try again." They practiced for another hour, until Evelyn's shoulder was sore, and her ears were ringing despite the bandana Jack had her wrap around her head for protection. By the end of the session, she'd managed to hit the bottle twice, one shot that shattered it completely, bringing a whoop of triumph from her throat. "That's enough for today," Jack said, clearly pleased. "You're a natural. Another few sessions and you'll be able to hit what you aim at consistently. When can we practice again?" He laughed. "Tomorrow, if you're not too sore. And Evelyn, I'm proud of you. Most Eastern ladies would have quit after the first shot." "I'm not most Eastern ladies," she said, and meant it. The days that followed fell into a rhythm. Mornings were for shooting practice with Jack, her accuracy improving with each session. Afternoons were spent at Uncle Thomas's property, working alongside the Crane brothers and Mrs. Guthrie to make the cabin livable. Evenings were for learning from Mrs. Guthrie. How to bake bread in a Dutch oven, how to render fat for soap, how to identify edible and medicinal plants in the desert. Each day, Evelyn felt herself changing, growing stronger and more capable. The soft hand she'd brought from Boston became calloused. The pale skin that had never seen direct sun darkened despite her bonnet. The uncertainty that had plagued her began to solidify into something like confidence. 2 weeks after her arrival, Jack announced at breakfast that they needed to go back into Whispering Creek. "Bank business," he said. "Mr. Pemberton should have your account ready to transfer." The ride into town felt different this time. Evelyn was no longer the lost woman who'd stepped off the train. She sat straighter in the wagon seat, met the curious stares of townspeople with calm acknowledgement rather than fear. When they entered the bank, Mr. Pemberton greeted her with professional courtesy. "Miss Hart, excellent timing. I have all the documents ready for your signature. Once you sign, the account transfers completely into your name. You'll have full access to the funds." Evelyn signed where he indicated, her hand steady. With each stroke of the pen, she felt the weight of independence settling onto her shoulders. This was her money, her property, her future. No man could take it from her. No scandal could strip it away. It was solid, real, hers. "Congratulations, Miss Hart," Mr. Pemberton said when the last signature was complete. "You are now a woman of property in the Arizona Territory. I hope you'll consider keeping your account with us as you build your life here." "I will, Mr. Pemberton. Thank you for your assistance." As they left the bank, Jack said quietly, "How does it feel?" "Terrifying," Evelyn admitted, "and wonderful, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknown." "That's exactly what it is." He helped her into the wagon. "Evelyn, I need to tell you something. There's been word of rustlers working the southern ranges. Sheriff Wyatt's organizing men to patrol, and I've volunteered to ride with them for a few days. Mrs. Guthrie will stay at the ranch with you, and the Crane brothers will be around. You'll be perfectly safe." "When do you leave?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll be back by the end of the week." Something in Evelyn's chest tightened at the thought of Jack's absence, which was absurd. She barely knew the man, had known him for all of 2 weeks. Yet his steady presence had become a kind of anchor, grounding her as she navigated this new life. The thought of him riding off to confront dangerous criminals made her stomach twist with worry. "Be careful," she said, then felt foolish for saying it. Jack Fletcher had survived a war and 8 years in rough territory. He didn't need her concern. But he smiled, and something warm flickered in his gray-blue eyes. "I will. You keep practicing with that rifle while I'm gone. Maybe by the time I get back, you'll be able to hit targets at 50 yards. "I'll do my best." That evening, after Jack had left to check on his cattle one last time before departing, Evelyn found herself restless. She walked to the edge of the ranch property and looked out at the desert, now painted in twilight colors. The vastness no longer frightened her. Instead, it felt full of possibility. In 2 weeks, she'd learned to shoot, to work with her hands, to imagine a future she'd never thought possible. She had property, money, skills she was building day by day. She had friends in Mrs. Guthrie and the Crane brothers. She had purpose. And she realized with a start, the beginning of feelings for Jack Fletcher that went beyond gratitude. Feelings she couldn't quite name yet, but that warmed her chest and made her hyper-aware of his presence whenever he was near. "That's foolish," she whispered to the empty desert. "You've known him 2 weeks. You're grateful, that's all. Don't confuse gratitude with something else." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't quite true. What she felt for Jack was more complicated than gratitude. It was respect, certainly, admiration for how he lived his life with quiet integrity. But there was also attraction, the flutter in her stomach when he stood close, the way her breath caught when their hands brushed accidentally, the fact that his face was the last thing she thought of before sleep and the first thing she remembered upon waking. She was falling for him, and she had no idea what to do about it, or even if she should do anything at all. She was still healing from Randall's betrayal, still learning who she was outside of Boston's constraints. The last thing she needed was to complicate her new life with romantic feelings for a man who'd offered her nothing but neighborly kindness. One thing at a time, she told herself firmly. First, build a life. Everything else can wait. But as she walked back toward the ranch house, where lamplight glowed warm in the windows and Mrs. Guthrie was surely preparing supper, Evelyn couldn't quite suppress the hope that maybe, just maybe, everything else wouldn't have to wait forever. Jack left before dawn the next morning, his saddlebags packed and his rifle secured to his horse. Evelyn heard him ride out from her bedroom window, the sound of hoofbeats fading into the pre-dawn darkness. She tried to go back to sleep but couldn't, so she dressed and went to help Mrs. Guthrie with breakfast. "He'll be fine," the older woman said without looking up from the biscuits she was forming. "Jack Fletcher survived worse than a few cattle thieves. Stop worrying." "I'm not worried," Evelyn protested, then caught Mrs. Guthrie's knowing look. "All right, I'm a little worried, but only because he's been so kind to me. I'd hate for anything to happen to him." "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Guthrie's tone was entirely too knowing. "That's all it is, I'm sure." Evelyn felt heat rise to her cheeks. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, child. Just observing. You watch him when he's not looking. He watches you when you're not looking. Neither of you seems to realize the other is doing the same thing." Mrs. Guthrie slid the biscuits into the oven. "But that's neither here nor there. You've got more important things to focus on right now, like figuring out how to run that property of yours." The deflection was obvious but welcome. Evelyn wasn't ready to examine her feelings for Jack too closely. especially not with the perceptive Mrs. Guthrie watching her reactions. The days without Jack felt strange. The ranch continued its rhythms, the hands went about their work, the cattle needed tending, the horses required care, but something felt missing. Evelyn threw herself into learning, spending mornings practicing her shooting alone, afternoons working at Uncle Thomas's cabin with the Crane brothers. Billy had brought chickens as promised, 6 hens and a rooster now clucking contentedly in the repaired coop. Sam was teaching her the basics of caring for livestock, while Will focused on getting the garden plot ready for fall planting. "You'll want to put in winter vegetables come October," Will explained, turning soil with his spade. "Carrots, turnips, cabbage. They'll grow through the mild months, give you fresh food when everything else is scarce." "And in spring?" Evelyn asked, making notes in a small journal she'd started keeping. "Spring's for the quick crops, lettuce, radishes, peas. Then in late spring you plant your summer vegetables, tomatoes, squash, beans, corn. It's a cycle, see? Always something growing, always something to harvest if you plan it right." The practical knowledge felt precious. Each skill she learned, each bit of information she absorbed, made her future feel more solid. She was building something real, piece by piece. On the 3rd day of Jack's absence, Sheriff Wyatt rode out to the ranch. Evelyn's heart leapt into her throat when she saw him approaching. Law enforcement only came calling when there was trouble. She met him at the porch, Mrs. Guthrie appearing behind her like a protective shadow. "Sheriff," Evelyn said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Is Jack all right?" Wyatt dismounted, his expression reassuring. "He's fine, Miss Hart. Actually, I came to talk to you about something else entirely. Got word you're planning to move into your uncle's place come October." "That's right." "Well, I wanted to give you some information you should know. The rustlers we're tracking, they've been hitting ranches in the Southern Territory, like I said, but they're moving north. We think they're testing boundaries, seeing where they can operate without drawing too much attention. Your property sits on the edge of what we'd consider vulnerable territory." Evelyn's stomach tightened. "You're saying they might target me?" "I'm saying a woman alone on an isolated property makes an easy target for men with no conscience. I'm not trying to scare you, just being straight with you. You should know the risks." Wyatt shifted his weight. "Now, I don't think you should change your plans. This is your land, your right to live there. But you need to be smart about it. Keep that rifle loaded and handy. If you see riders you don't recognize, don't engage, get to cover and wait for them to leave. And maybe consider getting a dog. Dogs hear trouble before people do." Mrs. Guthrie stepped forward. "Sheriff, I'm planning to stay with Miss Hart for her first month at the property. That help ease your concerns any?" "Some," Wyatt admitted. 2 women are better than 1. But Mrs. Guthrie, you know as well as I do that if determined men want to cause trouble, it takes more than presence to stop them. It takes preparation and willingness to defend yourselves." "I can shoot," Evelyn said quietly. "Jack's been teaching me. I'm not an expert, but I can hit what I aim at least at close range." The sheriff studied her with new respect. "That's good. That's real good. And Miss Hart, if you do see trouble, you send word to Jack's ranch or to town immediately. We'll come running. The territorial code out here is simple. Neighbors look after neighbors. You're not alone in this, even when it feels like you are." After he left, Evelyn sat on the porch steps, processing what she'd just learned. The danger was real, not hypothetical. Men who stole cattle wouldn't hesitate to do worse if they thought they could get away with it. And an isolated woman on valuable property was exactly the kind of target they'd look for. "You're thinking of changing your plans," Mrs. Guthrie said, sitting beside her. "I'm thinking I might be foolish to go through with them." "Maybe. Or maybe you're brave enough to do what needs doing despite the risks." The older woman was quiet for a moment. "This territory doesn't reward cowardice, Evelyn, but it doesn't reward stupidity either. The question you need to ask yourself is whether you're being brave or being stupid by moving to that cabin." Evelyn thought about Uncle Thomas, living alone for years in that valley. He'd managed. He'd survived. If he could do it, why couldn't she? But then, he'd been a man, and that made all the difference in how the world treated him. A woman alone was vulnerable in ways a man alone never was. "I need to think about this," she said finally. "Good. You should think about it. Think hard. Because once you commit to that life, Changing your mind gets a lot harder. Mrs. Guthrie stood, dusting off her skirts. But while you're thinking, remember this. Your uncle wanted you to have that property for a reason. He believed you could handle it. Maybe trust his judgment. The fourth day without Jack brought a fierce windstorm that rattled the ranch buildings and sent dust devils spinning across the open land. Evelyn spent the day inside, reading more of Uncle Thomas's journal and thinking about the sheriff's warning. The journal entries revealed a man who'd faced his own fears about the isolation, who'd questioned his choices during long winter nights when the silence felt crushing. But they also showed a man who'd found peace in solitude, who'd learned to be comfortable with his own company. One entry stood out, dated from his second winter in the valley. The loneliness is the hardest part. Not the work, not the weather, not even the occasional danger from animals or desperate men. It's the silence. The knowledge that I could die out here and no one would know for weeks. That's the thought that wakes me at night, makes me question everything. But then morning comes. I make coffee, watch the sun rise over the ridge, listen to the creek running over stones, and I realize the silence isn't empty. It's full of wind and water and birdsong, full of my own thoughts, which I'm finally learning to trust again. The isolation that terrified me is becoming the thing that saves me. I am learning to be enough for myself. That's the gift this territory offers, the space to discover whether you can stand your own company, whether you're worth knowing. Evelyn read the passage 3 times, feeling the truth of it settle into her bones. That was what she needed to discover. Whether she could be enough for herself, whether she was worth knowing outside of society's definitions and expectations. Jack returned on the 5th day, riding in just after sunset with 2 other men from the posse. Evelyn heard the horses and came to the porch, her heart doing something complicated when she saw him dismount. He was dusty and tired, his face shadowed with several days' worth of beard, but he was whole and uninjured. "You're back," she said, then felt stupid for stating the obvious. "I'm back." His smile was tired but genuine. "We caught 3 of the rustlers, ran the others across the territorial line into Mexico. Sheriff thinks we've got a few weeks of peace before they regroup and try again." Mrs. Guthrie appeared with coffee and food, efficiently feeding the returning men before they dispersed to their own homes or bunks. Jack sat on the porch steps, drinking coffee like a man who'd been dreaming of it for days. "How are things here?" he asked. "Fine. Quiet. Sheriff Wyatt came by with a warning about the rustlers." Evelyn sat beside him, maintaining a careful distance. "He said my property might be vulnerable because I'm alone." Jack's expression darkened. "He's not wrong. Those men we caught, they talked eventually, said they'd been scouting isolated properties, looking for easy targets. A woman alone would definitely qualify. So maybe I'm being foolish to move to the cabin. Maybe," Jack set down his coffee cup and looked at her directly, "or maybe you just need to be smarter about it. Get a dog like Wyatt suggested. Keep the rifle loaded. Make sure people know to check on you regular like. Don't advertise that you're alone. Let folks think Mrs. Guthrie's staying permanent, or that you've got hands working the property. None of that changes the fundamental reality that I'll be isolated and vulnerable." "No, it doesn't." Jack's voice was gentle. "Evelyn, I won't lie to you. There's real danger in what you're planning. But there's danger everywhere. You could move to town, live in a boarding house, and still face danger from disease or fire or violent drunks. At least on your own property, you control your circumstances. You decide who comes near, who you trust. That's worth something. Is it worth risking my life? Only you can answer that." He stood, stretching muscles stiff from days in the saddle. "But I'll tell you what I think. I think you're strong enough to handle the isolation. I think you're smart enough to learn what you need to know. And I think you're brave enough to face the dangers head on instead of hiding from them. But none of that matters if you don't believe it yourself." He left her sitting on the porch steps, staring out at the darkening desert, his words echoing in her mind. Strong enough, smart enough, brave enough. Was she? Or was she just running from one bad situation into another, calling it courage, when it was really just desperation? That night, she lay awake for hours, listening to the wind rattle the windows. Somewhere outside, a coyote called, and another answered. The sounds that had frightened her 3 weeks ago now felt familiar, almost comforting. She'd changed in those weeks, grown stronger, more capable. But was it enough? The answer came to her in the quiet hours before dawn. It didn't matter whether it was enough. What mattered was whether she was willing to try. Uncle Thomas had been willing to try, even when he was broken and lost. He'd built a life in that valley through sheer determination and daily effort. She could do the same. Maybe she'd fail. Maybe the isolation would prove too much, or the danger too real. But at least she would have tried. At least she would have given herself the chance to discover what she was capable of. When morning came, she found Jack in the barn tending to his horse after the hard days of riding. "I want to move to the cabin in 2 weeks," she said without preamble. "Is that enough time to get everything ready?" Jack looked up from brushing his horse's coat, studying her face. Whatever he saw there must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. 2 weeks is enough. We'll need to make a final supply run, get you a dog, maybe reinforce the cabin's door and windows, but it's doable. And you'll teach me everything I need to know about reading weather, about handling problems, about surviving alone. I'll teach you what I can. The rest, you'll learn by doing. He set down the brush. "Evelyn, I need to say something, and I need you to hear it straight. If you do this, if you commit to living on that property, there will be times when you're scared, times when you question everything, times when the silence feels like it's crushing you. That's normal. That's part of the territory teaching you who you are. But you can't let fear make your decisions. You face it, acknowledge it, then do what needs doing anyway. Understand?" "I understand." "Good." Something shifted in his expression, became more personal. "And Evelyn, I'll be checking on you regular. Not because I think you can't handle it, but because that's what neighbors do. If you need help, if something happens, you send word, and I'll come. No judgment, no shame, just help. That's the code out here." The promise settled something in Evelyn's chest. She wouldn't be completely alone. She'd have Jack's support, Mrs. Guthrie's wisdom, the Crane brothers' practical help. She'd have the community Sheriff Wyatt had spoken of, the network of neighbors who looked after each other in this harsh territory. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for everything you've done, for believing I can do this." "I do believe it. Question is whether you believe it. I'm starting to." The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of preparation. Jack took Evelyn into town where they bought supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, salt, dried beans, lamp oil, ammunition, fabric for curtains and clothing. At the general store, the owner, a weathered man named Hobbs, looked at her purchases with interest. "Heard you're Thomas Hart's niece," he said. "Planning to stay then?" "I am." "Well, you'll be needing an account here. We extend credit to folks who are good for it, and anyone related to Thomas Hart is good for it in my book. You need something, you come see me. We'll settle up monthly." It was a small gesture, but it meant acceptance. The town was acknowledging her as a permanent resident, someone worth extending credit to. Evelyn felt a surge of pride and gratitude. They stopped at the sheriff's office, where Wyatt introduced her to his deputy, a young man named Martinez who promised to ride out to her property weekly to check on things. "Just routine," he assured her. "We do it for all the isolated ranches. Nothing to be embarrassed about." At the Crane family ranch, Billy's father sold her 3 heifers and a calf at a fair price. "They're good stock," he said, "bred to handle the heat in the scrub. You treat them right, they'll give you calves every year. Build up a herd slowly, that's the way to do it." Jack also introduced her to the Mitchell family, who had a litter of puppies. The father was a cattle dog, the mother part, wolf. The resulting puppies were large, alert, and protective. Evelyn chose a female with golden eyes and a black and tan coat. "What will you name her?" Jack asked as they rode back with the puppy sleeping in Evelyn's lap. "Century," Evelyn said, "because she'll stand watch with me." The puppy, as if understanding, opened one golden eye and looked at her before settling back into sleep. At the cabin, the final preparations took shape. The Crane brothers installed stronger shutters on the windows that could be barred from inside. Jack reinforced the door with additional planks and a heavy crossbar. Mrs. Guthrie stocked the root cellar with preserved foods and showed Evelyn how to ration supplies to last through a hard winter. You've got enough here for 6 months if you're careful, the older woman said, surveying the neat rows of jars and sacks. More if you're willing to hunt and forage. The creek never runs dry, so you'll always have water. Everything else is about planning and discipline. They spent an entire day going over emergency procedures. What to do if she got injured, how to signal for help if riders approached with bad intentions, where to hide if she couldn't fight, how to prepare the cabin for a siege if necessary. It was grim instruction, but necessary. I don't mean to scare you, Mrs. Guthrie said as they reviewed the plans, but I won't leave you unprepared either. The reality is that bad things can happen out here. Being ready for them is half the battle. On Evelyn's last night at Jack's ranch, he asked her to take a walk with him after supper. They walked in silence for a while, moving away from the ranch buildings into the open desert. The sun was setting, painting the world in shades of gold and crimson. There's something I need to tell you, Jack said finally, stopping at a small rise that overlooked the valley. Something I've been putting off, but you should hear it before you move to the cabin. Evelyn's heart began to pound. What is it? When Samuel Carter left me this ranch, he did it because he saw something in me worth saving. A man broken by war, drinking himself to death, picking fights just to feel something. He gave me work and purpose and a reason to keep living. He saved my life, Evelyn, and before he died, he made me promise something. Jack's voice was rough with emotion. Evelyn waited, giving him space to continue. He made me promise I'd pass on the kindness, that when I saw someone who needed help, who needed a second chance, I'd offer it without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. He said that's how goodness survives in a hard world, by being passed forward, person to person, generation to generation. That's why you helped me, Evelyn said softly. You were honoring Samuel's memory, and my uncle's. Yes, but... Jack turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. But it's become more than that. These past 3 weeks, watching you learn and grow and refuse to give up despite every reason you had to quit. Evelyn, you've become more to me than just Thomas's niece or someone who needed help. Her breath caught. Jack, let me finish. He held up a hand. I'm not saying this to pressure you or complicate things. You're about to start a new chapter of your life, and you should do it with a clear head, without worrying about my feelings. But I'd be lying if I didn't admit that I've come to care for you, as more than a friend, more than a neighbor. I see your courage, your determination, your kindness, even when life's given you every reason to be bitter. And I find myself wanting to be part of your future, if you'll have me. Not now, he added quickly. Not while you're still figuring out who you are out here, but someday. When you're ready. If you're ever ready. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing. She'd known there was something between them, had felt the pull of attraction and respect and something deeper. But hearing him say it out loud, hearing the hope and vulnerability in his voice, made it real in a way she hadn't prepared for. I don't know what to say, she whispered. You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know. Needed to be honest before you moved to the cabin, before too much time passed and I lost my nerve. Jack managed a crooked smile. I'm not asking for an answer, Evelyn. I'm just telling you how I feel. What you do with that information is up to you. They walked back to the ranch in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of possibility, of futures yet to be written. Evelyn's mind churned with questions and emotions she couldn't quite name. She cared for Jack. More than cared, if she was being honest with herself. The thought of him made her chest feel warm and tight. The sight of him made her breath catch. His absence had left a hollow space that his return had filled, but she'd been betrayed before. Had trusted a man who'd lied and manipulated and destroyed her reputation without remorse. The scars from Randall's betrayal still ached. How could she trust her own judgment when it had failed her so catastrophically before? Jack, she said as they reached the ranch house, I need time. Not because I don't feel something for you, I do. But because I need to know I'm choosing from a place of strength, not gratitude or fear or loneliness. Do you understand? I do. His smile was gentle. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. That night, lying in bed for the last time in Jack's guest room, Evelyn thought about futures and possibilities. Tomorrow, she would move to Uncle Thomas's cabin. Tomorrow, her real test would begin. Living alone. proving she could survive, discovering who Evelyn Hart was when stripped of all society's definitions. And somewhere in that future, perhaps, was the possibility of Jack Fletcher, of a man who saw her clearly and cared for her anyway, who offered help without strings, who respected her strength while acknowledging her struggles. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. But then, that seemed to be the defining characteristic of her new life. Everything here was bigger, harder, more honest than anything she'd known in Boston. And she was learning to match that honesty with her own, learning to face fear without flinching, learning to want things and claim them rather than waiting for permission to exist. Morning came too quickly and too slowly at once. Mrs. Guthrie had breakfast ready before dawn, a final feast of eggs and bacon and fresh biscuits, more food than Evelyn could possibly eat, but appreciated all the same. Jack loaded her trunk and supplies into the wagon while Billy Crane saddled a horse he'd brought for Evelyn to keep. "She's gentle," Billy assured her. "Name's Copper, on account of her color. She'll serve you well for riding into town or over to neighboring ranches." Evelyn ran her hand down the mare's neck, feeling the warm, solid presence of the animal. Another piece of her new life clicking into place. She had property, money, skills, livestock, a dog, and now a horse. She had everything she needed to survive. Whether she had everything she needed to thrive remained to be seen. The ride to the cabin felt both too long and too short. Sentry sat between Evelyn and Mrs. Guthrie in the wagon, alert and watchful. Jack rode ahead on his horse, leading Copper. The Crane brothers had gone ahead earlier to make sure everything was ready. When they crested the final rise and the valley spread before them, Evelyn felt her throat tighten with emotion. The cabin looked welcoming in the morning light, smoke rising from the chimney where Billy must have started a fire. The repaired corral held her new cattle. The garden plot was ready for planting. The creek sparkled in the sunlight, cottonwood leaves rustling in the breeze. This was hers, all of it. Her land, her home, her future. "Welcome home," Mrs. Guthrie said softly, and Evelyn realized with a start that it was true. This wasn't just property she'd inherited, it was home. The first real home she'd had since her parents died. A place she'd chosen, worked for, earned through her own effort and courage. They unloaded the wagon, carrying her belongings into the cabin. Jack hung her uncle's rifle over the door, within easy reach. Mrs. Guthrie organized the kitchen with practiced efficiency. The Crane brothers showed her the improvements they'd made. A better latch on the chicken coop, additional firewood stacked against the cabin wall, repairs to the corral fence. By noon, everything was in place. Her trunk sat at the foot of her bed. Her books lined the shelves. Her supplies filled the pantry. Coffee steamed in a pot over the fire. Sentry had already claimed a spot near the hearth, watching everything with alert golden eyes. "Well," Mrs. Guthrie said, looking around with satisfaction, "I'd say you're as ready as anyone can be. The rest is up to you and time." Jack pulled Evelyn aside as the others began preparing to leave. "Remember what I taught you. Remember you're not alone, even when it feels like it. And Evelyn," he hesitated, then continued, "remember what I said last night. No pressure, no expectation. Just know that when you're ready, if you're ready, I'll be waiting." "I'll remember," she promised. She stood on the porch with Sentry beside her and watched them leave, Jack on his horse, Mrs. Guthrie and the Crane brothers in the wagon. They grew smaller in the distance, dust rising behind them, until finally they disappeared over the ridge and she was alone. Completely alone. The silence rushed in like a physical presence. Evelyn stood very still, listening to it. The rustle of cottonwood leaves, the burble of the creek, the distant cry of a hawk, her own breathing, Sentry's soft panting beside her. It wasn't empty silence. It was full, just as Uncle Thomas had written in his journal, full of life and possibility and the space to simply be. She took a deep breath and felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been wound tight since Randall's betrayal, since Aunt Millicent's rejection, since the long journey west. She was here. She'd made it. And whether she succeeded or failed at this new life, at least she would fail or succeed on her own terms. "All right," she said to Sentry, to the valley, to herself. "Let's begin." The first night alone in the cabin, Evelyn barely slept. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. The creak of settling wood, the scratch of branches against the roof, Sentry's occasional soft growl at noises only the dog could hear. Evelyn lay in Uncle Thomas's bed, now her bed, staring at the ceiling and wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. The isolation pressed against her like a physical weight, and she understood viscerally what her uncle had written about the silence that woke him in the night. But morning came, as it always did. Sunlight streamed through the eastern window, painting everything in shades of gold. The coffee she made tasted better than any she'd had at Jack's ranch, perhaps because she'd made it herself in her own home. She fed Sentry, collected eggs from the chickens, checked on the cattle in the corral. Simple tasks, but they gave the day structure and purpose. By the end of the first week, a rhythm had established itself. She woke with the sun, did the morning chores, spent midday hours reading or working on improving the cabin, then devoted afternoons to learning the land. She walked the boundaries of her property with Sentry, memorizing landmarks and natural features. She followed the creek to its source in the hills, discovered a small grove of wild plum trees, found evidence of deer and javelina. The valley was revealing itself to her, becoming familiar rather than foreign. Mrs. Guthrie arrived on the 8th day as promised, her wagon loaded with her own belongings and more supplies. "Well," the older woman said, surveying Evelyn critically, "you haven't died or run back to town screaming. That's a good start." "It's been harder than I expected," Evelyn admitted, "and easier in some ways. I thought I'd be terrified every night, but mostly I'm just tired. The work leaves me too exhausted for fear." That's the secret nobody tells you about frontier life. It's not courage that keeps you going most days. It's being too damn tired to be scared. Mrs. Guthrie unpacked her things in the second bedroom. "Now, let's see what you've learned. Show me your routine." For the next 3 weeks, Mrs. Guthrie refined what Jack and the Crane brothers had taught Evelyn. She showed her how to preserve meat by smoking and salting, how to make soap from wood ash and rendered fat, how to identify medicinal plants in the desert and prepare them for common ailments. They worked together in the garden, planting winter vegetables and building a fence to keep out rabbits and javelina. They reinforced the chicken coop after a coyote tried to break in one night. They practiced with the rifle until Evelyn could consistently hit targets at 75 yards. "You're a natural shot," Mrs. Guthrie observed after Evelyn shattered 3 bottles in succession. "Better than most men I've known? That'll serve you well if trouble comes calling." Trouble came sooner than expected. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October when Sentry began barking furiously at the cabin door. Evelyn had been kneading bread dough, and she quickly wiped her hands and grabbed the rifle from above the door. Mrs. Guthrie appeared from the garden, her face alert and worried. "Riders?" the older woman said tersely. "3 of them, coming up from the south." Evelyn's heart hammered as she peered through the window. 3 men on horseback were approaching the cabin at an easy pace, not hurried but purposeful. They wore dusty clothes and had the rough look of men who lived hard lives. One of them had a rifle across his saddle. Another wore 2 pistols low on his hips. "Do you recognize them?" Evelyn asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "No, and that's what worries me." Mrs. Guthrie positioned herself near the other window, her own rifle, smaller but deadly, in her hands. "Let me do the talking. You just look ready to shoot if things go sideways." The riders stopped about 20 yards from the cabin. The man in front, older than the others with a graying beard, called out in a voice meant to sound friendly, but didn't quite achieve it. "Hello, the house. We're just passing through, looking for water for our horses. Saw your creek and thought we'd ask permission to water them." Mrs. Guthrie opened the door slightly, keeping her rifle visible. "Creek's free to anyone who asks polite. Water your horses and move on." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the 2 women, the rifle, the defensive posture. "Much obliged, ma'am. Say, this is Thomas Hart's old place, isn't it? Heard he passed. You ladies related to him?" "The property has a new owner," Mrs. Guthrie said flatly. "Owner who's well protected and well connected in town. Sheriff Wyatt rides out here regular to check on things." It was a lie, but a strategic one. The man's expression shifted, calculation visible in his eyes. He glanced at his companions, some unspoken communication passing between them. "Well, we wouldn't want to trouble anyone. Just water, and we'll be on our way." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Much obliged for your hospitality." They watered their horses at the creek, taking longer than necessary and clearly assessing the property. Evelyn watched from the window, her finger near the rifle's trigger, every muscle tense. Sentry growled low and continuous, the hair on her back standing up. The dog knew these men meant harm, even if they hadn't acted on it yet. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, the riders mounted up and rode north. But the older man turned in his saddle and looked back at the cabin, his gaze lingering in a way that made Evelyn's skin crawl. "They'll be back," Mrs. Guthrie said grimly once the riders disappeared from view. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but they'll be back." They were scouting, seeing what kind of resistance they'd face. "What do we do?" "We send word to Jack and the sheriff, and we prepare." The older woman's face was set and determined. "This is exactly the scenario we planned for. Time to put that planning into action." They spent the afternoon fortifying the cabin. Additional supplies were moved from the root cellar into the main room so they wouldn't have to venture outside if the property was under watch. Ammunition was checked and counted. Water barrels were filled. The shutters on all windows were tested to ensure they'd hold against forced entry. Mrs. Guthrie wrote 2 notes, one for Jack, one for Sheriff Wyatt, describing the riders in detail. "Billy Crane should be by tomorrow for his weekly check," Mrs. Guthrie said. "He can carry these to town and to Jack's ranch. Within a day we'll have help if we need it." That night they took turns keeping watch. Evelyn sat by the window during the midnight to dawn shift, rifle across her lap, watching the moonlit valley for any sign of movement. Sentry dozed at her feet, but the dog's ears swiveled at every small sound, alert even in sleep. Evelyn thought about Jack's words, that she was strong enough, smart enough, brave enough. She hoped he was right, because whatever was coming, she would need to be all 3 and more. Billy Crane arrived mid-morning as expected, and his easy smile vanished when Mrs. Guthrie described the previous day's visitors. "I'll ride straight to town," he promised. "Get the sheriff and his deputy out here, and I'll stop by Jack's place on the way back. You ladies sit tight and keep that rifle handy." Jack arrived before sunset, riding hard with 2 of his ranch hands. Evelyn's heart lifted at the sight of him dismounting, his face creased with concern. He strode to the cabin, and she met him at the door. "Are you all right?" he asked, his hands reaching for hers before he seemed to remember propriety and dropped them back to his sides. "I'm fine." "We're fine, just shaken." She ushered him inside where Mrs. Guthrie was preparing supper. They didn't do anything, just watered their horses and looked around. But the way they looked, I know. Billy described them, and one matches the description of a man we chased into Mexico 3 weeks ago. Seems he came back. Jack's expression was grim. "Sheriff's organizing a patrol. He'll be here by morning with 6 men. We'll track these bastards and make sure they understand this property is off limits." "What if they come back tonight?" Evelyn asked. "Then they'll find more than 2 women and a dog." Jack gestured to his ranch hands, both armed and capable-looking men. "Miguel and Tom will camp outside, keep watch. I'll sleep in the barn with my rifle. Anyone approaches this cabin without permission, they'll answer to us first." The arrangement should have made Evelyn feel weak, protected like a helpless child. Instead, she felt grateful and respected. Jack wasn't taking over. He was supporting her, reinforcing her defense rather than replacing it. There was a crucial difference. Sheriff Wyatt arrived at dawn with his promised patrol, 6 men including Deputy Martinez, all well-armed and experienced trackers. They found the riders' trail easily and followed it north into rougher territory. Jack went with them, leaving his ranch hands to continue watching the cabin. "They'll find them," Mrs. Guthrie said with confidence as they watched the patrol ride out. "And when they do, those men will either leave the territory or face territorial justice. Either way, they won't be coming back here." The waiting was harder than the initial confrontation. Evelyn tried to keep busy with chores, but her mind kept drifting to Jack riding into potential danger. She realized with startling clarity that her feelings for him had deepened beyond what she'd been willing to admit. The thought of him being hurt, of never seeing his storm cloud eyes or crooked smile again, made her chest ache. "You're in love with him," Mrs. Guthrie said, not a question, but a statement of observed fact. Evelyn startled from her thoughts. "What?" "Jack Fletcher. You're in love with him. Don't bother denying it. I've seen the way you watch for him, the way your whole face changes when he rides up, the way you've been pacing this cabin like a caged animal since he rode out with the patrol." "I hardly know him," Evelyn protested weakly. You know what matters. You know he's honest and brave and kind. You know he sees you as a person, not a possession or a prize. You know he respects your strength while offering his own when you need it. Mrs. Guthrie's expression softened. That's more than most people know about their spouses after years of marriage. Time doesn't make love real, Evelyn. Truth does. I'm afraid, Evelyn admitted in a whisper. I was so wrong about Randall. I thought I knew him, thought I loved him, and he destroyed me without a second thought. How can I trust my own judgment? Because Randall taught you what to avoid. He showed you what false love looks like, so now you can recognize the real thing when it appears. Jack Fletcher is nothing like whatever that man was. Surely you see that. Evelyn did see it, had seen it from the first moment Jack offered his hand at the train platform. He'd never lied to her, never tried to manipulate or control. He'd given freely, help, knowledge, time, his own heart, without demanding anything in return. He'd told her he cared and then stepped back, giving her space to figure out her own feelings without pressure. That was love. Not the passionate, consuming kind that novels described, but something steadier and more enduring, the kind built on respect and honesty and shared values. What if he doesn't come back? Evelyn asked, voicing her deepest fear. Then you grieve and eventually heal and keep living, because that's what strong women do. But Evelyn, Mrs. Guthrie gripped her shoulders. Don't waste the present worrying about a future that might never happen. If you love him, tell him. Don't wait for the perfect moment or absolute certainty. Those things don't exist. Tell him while you can. The patrol returned 2 days later, all men accounted for and unharmed. They'd tracked the riders to an abandoned mining camp, where a brief gunfight had resulted in one rustler wounded and the other two captured. No lawmen had been injured. The wounded man and his companions were being transported to the territorial prison to await trial. Jack rode straight to the cabin, dust-covered and exhausted. Evelyn ran to meet him, propriety forgotten, and he caught her in his arms as she launched herself at him. Thank God, she breathed into his shoulder. Thank God you're all right. His arms tightened around her. Did you doubt I would be? Every minute you were gone. She pulled back enough to look at his face, drinking in the sight of him whole and safe. Jack, I need to tell you something. Tell me inside, he said gently, where it's private. In the cabin, with Mrs. Guthrie tactfully withdrawing to the bedroom, Evelyn faced Jack across the small space. Her heart hammered, but she made herself speak the truth she'd been avoiding. You told me you cared for me, that you wanted to be part of my future if I'd have you. She took a shaky breath. I was afraid to believe it, afraid to trust my own judgment after Randall, afraid I was confusing gratitude with something deeper. But these past 2 days, wondering if you'd come back safe, made me understand something. I'm not grateful to you, Jack Fletcher. I'm in love with you. His eyes widened, hope dawning in their gray-blue depths. I love your integrity, Evelyn continued, the words coming faster now. Your quiet strength, the way you see me as I am and don't try to make me into something else. The way you offered help and then stepped back to let me find my own strength. I love that you challenge me and support me in equal measure. I love, her voice caught, I love you. And if the offer still stands, if you still want me, I'm saying yes. Yes to a future together. Yes to building something here with you. Just yes. Jack crossed the space between them in 2 strides and cupped her face in his calloused hands. The offer stands. It'll always stand. Evelyn, I've been half in love with you since you stepped off that train looking lost and determined in equal measure. Watching you grow into this life, seeing you claim your strength. It's been an honor. And if you'll have me, I promise you this. I'll never lie to you, never try to control you, never make you small to make myself feel big. I'll stand beside you, not in front of you. I'll be your partner, not your owner. And I'll love you every day of my life in the quiet, honest way this territory taught me. That's everything I want, Evelyn whispered. That's all I've ever wanted. When he kissed her, it felt like coming home, like the final piece of her new life clicking into place. She'd come west broken and desperate, expecting nothing. She'd found property and independence and purpose. And now, impossibly, she'd found love. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Jack rested his forehead against hers. I should do this properly. Should court you, ask permission, make it respectable. We're in the middle of the Arizona territory, Evelyn pointed out, smiling. I own property. You own property. We're both adults. Who exactly would we ask permission from? Fair point. He laughed, the sound full of joy. Then I'm asking you directly, Evelyn Hart. Will you marry me? Build a life with me? Face whatever this hard territory throws at us, together? Yes, she said simply. Yes to all of it. Mrs. Guthrie emerged from the bedroom, her eyes suspiciously bright. Well, finally. I was starting to think you two would dance around this forever. Now, when's the wedding? We'll need to organize— Soon, Jack interrupted. As soon as we can arrange it. I'm not waiting weeks or months for propriety's sake when I've already found what I've been looking for. They were married 3 weeks later beneath the cottonwood trees near the cabin, the same trees where Uncle Thomas had apparently prayed for family. It wasn't a fancy wedding. Evelyn wore a simple blue dress Mrs. Guthrie had helped her make, and Jack wore his only suit, slightly worn but clean and pressed. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister who happened to be passing through Whispering Creek. The guests included Mrs. Guthrie, the Crane family, Sheriff Wyatt and his wife, several of Jack's ranch hands, and a surprising number of townspeople who'd driven out to the valley to witness the union. Your uncle would be proud, Billy Crane said during the celebration afterward. He wanted you to have a home here. Looks like you got that and more. Evelyn looked around at the gathering, neighbors and friends, people who'd become important to her in just 2 months. She looked at the valley spread before her, golden in the afternoon light. She looked at Jack, his hand warm in hers, his eyes full of love and promise. He gave me more than a home, she said. He gave me the freedom to discover who I could be. Everything else grew from that. The celebration lasted until sunset, when the guests finally began the journey back to their own homes and ranches. Mrs. Guthrie had packed her belongings earlier, planning to return to Jack's ranch and give the newlyweds privacy. You'll be all right, she asked Evelyn, her tone motherly despite the gruffness. I'll be better than all right. I have everything I need. Evelyn hugged the older woman tightly. Thank you for teaching me, for believing in me, for being the family I needed. You did the hard part yourself, child. I just pointed you in the right direction. Mrs. Guthrie pulled back, her eyes bright with unshed tears. You make a good life here, and when babies come, you send word. I'll want to spoil them properly. After everyone left, Jack and Evelyn stood on the cabin porch watching the last light fade from the sky. Sentry dozed at their feet. The cattle lowed softly in the corral. The chickens had already settled for the night. Everything was peaceful, settled, right. What are you thinking? Jack asked, his arm around her waist. I'm thinking about the woman who stepped off the train 2 months ago. How terrified and lost she was. How certain she was that her life was over. Evelyn leaned into his solid warmth. And I'm thinking about how wrong she was. Her life wasn't ending. It was beginning. Our life, Jack corrected gently. It's our life now. Our life, Evelyn agreed, savoring the word. Our. A simple word, but full of promise and possibility. They went inside as true darkness fell, and Jack built up the fire while Evelyn made coffee. It was domestic and simple and absolutely perfect. They sat together at the small table, their hands intertwined, and talked about the future, about combining their properties into a single larger ranch, about building a new house big enough for the family they hoped to have, about the garden Evelyn wanted to expand and the cattle Jack planned to breed. Practical plans built on honest work and shared vision. Later, in the darkness of the bedroom, Jack held her close and whispered against her hair. I meant what I said in my vows. You've made me believe in second chances, in the possibility of happiness after loss, in finding light even in the darkest places. You did the same for me, Evelyn said. You saw me when I felt invisible. You offered hope when I had none left. You gave me the space to become who I was meant to be. We saved each other then. We did. The weeks that followed established new rhythms. Jack moved his essential belongings to the cabin, though they spent time at his ranch as well, managing both properties. They hired 2 of the Crane brothers to help with the daily work, combining their herds and planning for spring calving. Evelyn's garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables even as winter approached. She learned to can and preserve, filling the root cellar with food they'd grown themselves. Deputy Martinez stopped by weekly, as promised, and his visits became social calls as much as security checks. Sheriff Wyatt rode out monthly to share news from town and ensure all was well. The Crane family visited regularly, and Mrs. Guthrie came for Sunday dinners, always bringing fresh bread and sharp observations about how married life was treating the newlyweds. By December, Evelyn had been in the territory for 3 months, married for 6 weeks, and felt like she'd lived there forever. The harsh landscape had become familiar, beloved even. She knew the way the light changed with the seasons, how to read the sky for coming weather, which plants would bloom in spring. She knew her neighbors, understood the unspoken codes of frontier hospitality and mutual support. She'd become part of the community, no longer an outsider but a valued member. On Christmas morning, she woke to find Jack already up, stoking the fire against the cold. Snow had fallen during the night, rare for the territory but not unheard of, and the valley was transformed into something magical. The cottonwoods wore mantles of white, and the creek ran dark against the pristine landscape. "Merry Christmas," Jack said, pulling her into his arms. "I have something for you." He produced a small wooden box, hand-carved with intricate designs. Inside was a silver ring, simple but beautifully made, with a small turquoise stone set in the band. "The stone's from the territory," he explained. "Found it myself in the hills north of here. Had it set by a silversmith in Tucson. I wanted you to have something that represents both where you came from and where you are now. Silver from back east, turquoise from the west. The past and the future together." Evelyn's vision blurred with tears as he slipped it onto her finger. "It's perfect. Jack, I didn't get you anything." "You gave me everything," he interrupted. "You gave me hope and purpose and love. That's worth more than any gift." They spent Christmas quietly, just the two of them, cooking a simple meal and reading by the fire. It was peaceful and warm and exactly what Evelyn wanted. She thought about Christmas in Boston, the elaborate parties, the expensive gifts, the suffocating propriety. This was so much better. This was real. In January, Mrs. Guthrie arrived with news. "Got a letter from town," she announced, bustling into the cabin with her usual efficiency. "Seems a family's moving into the territory from Missouri. Husband, wife, 3 children. They've purchased land about 6 miles south of here. You'll have neighbors closer than just the Cranes." "That's wonderful," Evelyn said, genuinely pleased. "More families means more community." "It means more than that," Mrs. Guthrie said meaningfully. "It means the territory's growing, becoming civilized. In a few years, there'll be a proper school, maybe even a church. This valley won't be isolated frontier forever. It'll be settled country." Evelyn looked around the cabin, her home, and felt a surge of satisfaction. She'd arrived when the territory was raw and dangerous. She'd claimed her place through courage and hard work, and now she'd be part of watching it grow into something more. Her children, if she had them, would grow up in a place that was both wild and civilized, both challenging and supportive. That evening, as she and Jack sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors, she told him about the new family. "It'll change things," he observed. "More people, more structure, more rules." "Is that bad?" "No, it's just different. The territory that saved me, the wild, empty spaces, they won't exist forever. But maybe that's all right. Maybe every generation needs its own frontier, its own way of finding itself." He squeezed her hand. "We got here when we needed to. We found what we were looking for. That's what matters." "What were you looking for?" Evelyn asked. "When you first came west?" Jack was quiet for a long moment, his gaze on the distant mountains. "Peace, I think. A way to live with what I'd done and seen in the war. A purpose beyond just surviving." He turned to look at her. "I found it, eventually. Found it in hard work and honest living, and finally in you. What about you? What were you looking for?" Evelyn considered the question carefully. "Freedom, I suppose. The ability to define myself by my own standards. To fail or succeed based on my own choices, not society's judgments. To be seen and valued for who I actually am." She smiled. "I found it too. In this valley, in this life, is in you." We're lucky, Jack said softly. Not everyone finds what they're looking for. No, Evelyn agreed, but we're also brave. We were willing to leave everything behind and start over, willing to work hard and face our fears. Luck helped, but courage got us here. As spring arrived, bringing wildflowers to the desert and new calves to their combined herd, Evelyn discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She thought about her mother who died when Evelyn was young, about the dangers of childbirth, especially in isolated territory. But she also thought about the future. A child raised in this honest place, taught to value courage and integrity, given the freedom to become whoever they were meant to be. When she told Jack, he swept her into his arms, his face alight with joy. A baby. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy? She asked, needing to hear it. Happier than I have any right to be. Evelyn, you've given me everything. A home, a purpose, and now a family. I never thought I'd have any of that after the war. I thought I was too broken, too damaged, but you saw something worth loving anyway. You were never broken, she said firmly. Just hurt. There's a difference, and now we'll raise a child who understands that difference, who knows that surviving hard times doesn't make you weak, it makes you strong. The baby, a girl they named Sarah, after Mrs. Guthrie, was born in September during the first cool days of autumn. Mrs. Guthrie attended the birth, along with the doctor from town, and the cabin filled with the sound of new life crying lustily. Jack held his daughter with tears streaming down his face, and Evelyn thought she'd never seen anything more beautiful than this rough cowboy cradling their tiny baby with such tenderness. She's perfect, he whispered. Absolutely perfect. She's ours, Evelyn said. That's what makes her perfect. As the years passed, the valley changed and grew. The family from Missouri became good friends, their children playing with Sarah as she grew. More families arrived, drawn by tales of good land and honest living. A small school was built, then a church. The town of Whispering Creek expanded, adding new businesses and better roads. The wild frontier gradually transformed into settled territory, though pockets of wildness remained in the distant hills and deep canyons. Evelyn and Jack's ranch prospered. They built a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Sarah was joined by two brothers, Thomas and Samuel, named for the men who'd made their life possible. The children grew up learning both book knowledge and practical skills, equally comfortable with literature and cattle, mathematics, and survival. They knew their mother's story, how she'd arrived broken and afraid and transformed herself through courage and hard work. They knew their father's story, how the war had damaged him and the territory had healed him. On the 10th anniversary of Evelyn's arrival in Arizona Territory, Jack surprised her with a picnic at the cabin where it had all begun. The structure was still sound, now used for storage and as a guest house when family visited. They sat beneath the same cottonwood trees where they'd married, watching their children play in the creek. "Do you ever regret it?" Jack asked. "Leaving Boston, coming here, choosing this life?" Evelyn looked at the valley spread before them, the land they'd worked, the community they'd helped build, the family they'd created. She thought about the frightened woman who'd stepped off the train a decade ago, lost and desperate. She thought about how that woman had discovered reserves of strength she'd never known she possessed, how she'd learned to shoot and ride and survive, how she'd found love in the most unexpected place. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This life is hard, Jack. It's demanding and sometimes scary and never easy. But it's real, it's honest, and it's mine. Ours. That's worth more than all the comfort and security Boston could have offered. No regrets about the scandal? About Randall's betrayal? Especially not about that, because if he hadn't betrayed me, I never would have left. I'd still be in Boston, slowly suffocating under the weight of society's expectations, married to some proper man who saw me as an ornament rather than a partner. Randall's betrayal freed me, even though it didn't feel like freedom at the time. It forced me to leave, to start over, to discover who I really was. In a strange way, I'm grateful to him for that." Jack pulled her close. "I'm grateful to him too, then, because his betrayal led you here. To me. To this life." They sat in comfortable silence, watching their children and listening to the familiar sounds of the valley. The rustle of cottonwood leaves, the gurgle of the creek, the distant call of a hawk, sounds that had once been foreign, but now were home. Your uncle would be proud, Jack said eventually. He wanted to give you freedom and a chance to start over. You took what he offered and built something beautiful. We built it, Evelyn corrected, together. You and me and everyone who helped us along the way. Mrs. Guthrie and the Cranes and Sheriff Wyatt and all the neighbors who welcomed us. We built this life together. Together, Jack agreed. That's the only way anything worthwhile gets built. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in the brilliant colors Evelyn had learned to love, they gathered their children and headed home. The new house stood solid against the ridge, smoke rising from the chimney where Mrs. Guthrie was surely preparing supper. The cattle grazed peacefully in the expanded pastures. The horses dozed in the shade. Everything spoke of permanence and prosperity and hard-won peace. That night, after the children were asleep and the house was quiet, Evelyn stood on the porch of their home, the home they'd built together, and looked up at the star-filled sky. The vastness that had once frightened her now felt welcoming, full of possibility rather than threat. She'd come to this territory expecting nothing and received everything. She'd arrived broken and been made whole. She'd found not just survival but joy, not just independence but love, not just property but purpose. The cowboys' honest promise, given at a dusty train platform 10 years ago, had led to more than either of them could have imagined. A simple offer of help had become a partnership. A temporary shelter had become a permanent home. An unexpected attraction had become enduring love. Jack joined her on the porch, his arms sliding around her waist in the familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter. "What are you thinking about?" "Promises," Evelyn said, "and how the best ones are kept not through grand gestures but through daily choices, through showing up, doing the work, being honest even when it's hard." "I promise to keep showing up," Jack said softly, "every day for the rest of our lives." "I know you will," Evelyn replied, "and I promise the same, to build this life with you, day by day, promise by promise, until we're old and gray and surrounded by grandchildren." "That sounds perfect," Jack said. "That sounds like everything." And it was. Standing there beneath the Arizona stars, with the man she loved beside her and their children sleeping safely inside, Evelyn Hart Fletcher knew with absolute certainty that she'd found what she'd been searching for. Not salvation or rescue or even happiness, exactly, but something better. Something real. A life built on honest effort and mutual respect. A love earned through shared struggles and quiet moments. A home that was truly hers because she'd claimed it through courage and perseverance. The woman who'd stepped off the train desperate and afraid no longer existed. In her place stood someone stronger, wiser, more fully herself than she'd ever been allowed to be in Boston. The territory had stripped away everything false and revealed what was essential. And what was essential, Evelyn had discovered, was simple. Love. Purpose. Community. The freedom to define yourself by your own standards. The courage to keep moving forward even when the path was uncertain. Uncle Thomas had understood that. He'd lived it himself and wanted to give her the same gift. And now, standing on land she'd inherited, and beside a man she'd chosen, with children she'd brought into the world sleeping peacefully behind her, Evelyn understood it too. Understood what he'd tried to tell her in those letters and journal entries. That freedom wasn't about escaping judgment or avoiding hardship. It was about choosing your own path and walking it with integrity. About being exactly who you were without apology. About building something real with honest effort. She'd found that freedom in the Arizona territory. Found it, claimed it, and built a life upon it. And now, with Jack's steady presence beside her and the endless desert stars wheeling overhead, she knew with bone-deep certainty that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Home. Finally, truly home.